Welcome, young witch or wizard, to a tale of quiet strength and unwavering dedication. Tonight, we follow the extraordinary life of Minerva McGonagall, a woman whose wisdom was matched only by her courage, whose stern exterior concealed a heart that beat with fierce love for every student who passed through her care. As you settle into your cozy dormitory bed, let these words carry you through the life of perhaps the most devoted educator who ever lived. Close your eyes and drift into this chronicle of transformation and sacrifice, where every choice was made with honor and every battle fought with grace. In the rolling hills of Scotland, where ancient magic flows through heather and stone, there stood a village that had known centuries of ordinary life, unmarked by the extraordinary forces that shaped the wizarding world beyond its borders. The people of Caithness lived simple lives, their days measured by church bells and changing seasons, their nights filled with the comfortable certainty that tomorrow would bring much the same as today. They could never have imagined that their peaceful hamlet would become the birthplace of one of magical Britain's greatest educators, or that the love story unfolding in their midst would echo through generations with consequences both beautiful and tragic. Isabel Ross had been born into this world of secrets and concealment. Her magical heritage, a burden she carried like precious cargo that could never be safely set down. Her parents, wizards both, had chosen to live on the periphery of magical society, close enough to the Muggle world to understand its rhythms, but distant enough to maintain the careful separation that the statute of secrecy demanded. They had raised their daughter with full knowledge of both worlds, understanding that she would one day face choices that would define not only her own destiny but the lives of any children she might bear. The deception began innocently enough, as such things often do. Each September, when Isabel disappeared from the village for months at a time, her neighbors assumed she was attending some exclusive boarding school for young ladies, the kind of institution that wealthy families use to polish their daughters into proper wives and mothers. The explanation satisfied the curious and protected the secret, but it also created a web of lies that would eventually ensnare everyone Isabel came to love. Robert McGonagall was everything her parents had feared she might encounter: intelligent, principled, devastatingly handsome in the way that could make a young witch forget the careful boundaries that had been drilled into her since childhood. He possessed the kind of moral clarity that came from a life lived entirely in the light, unmarked by the shadows and compromises that defined existence in the magical world. As the village minister, he embodied the virtues that his community held most dear: honesty, compassion, an unshakable faith in the fundamental goodness of creation. Their courtship unfolded with the slow inevitability of seasons changing, each encounter deepening connections that neither fully understood. Isabel found herself drawn, not just to Robert's obvious qualities, but to his refreshing inability to see beyond the surface she presented. In his eyes, she was simply a remarkable young woman with unusual knowledge and occasionally eccentric interests. He never questioned her absences or wondered why she sometimes seemed to know things that she couldn't possibly have learned through conventional means. For Robert, Isabel represented everything he had dreamed of finding in a partner: quick wit matched with genuine kindness, beauty enhanced by intelligence, a spirit that could challenge his thinking while supporting his deepest convictions. He was a man who believed in the power of love to overcome any obstacle, who trusted that honesty and dedication could bridge any gap between two hearts that truly belonged together. The irony that his greatest love was built upon fundamental deception was lost on him completely. The years of Isabel's Hogwarts education passed like a carefully orchestrated dance of truth and concealment. Each return to the village required her to shed her magical identity like an uncomfortable cloak, transforming herself back into the person Robert believed her to be. She became expert at deflecting questions about her schooling, spinning vague stories about literature and languages that satisfied curiosity without revealing anything substantial. Her magical abilities remained hidden, suppressed through careful self-control that became as natural as breathing. But love has a way of making even the most practiced deception feel unbearable. As Isabel grew into young womanhood and her feelings for Robert deepened into something that consumed her waking thoughts and haunted her dreams, the weight of her secret became increasingly difficult to bear. She found herself lying awake in her dormitory at Hogwarts, staring at the ceiling while her roommates slept, wondering if love built on deception could ever truly flourish, or if she was condemning both herself and Robert to a future poisoned by the very foundation on which it rested. The decision to run away together was made in a moment of desperate courage. When Isabel's graduation from Hogwarts coincided with her 18th birthday, and the overwhelming realization that she could no longer live divided between two worlds. Robert's proposal had been everything she had dreamed of, tender, heartfelt, accompanied by promises of a life filled with the kind of simple happiness that her magical upbringing had taught her to view as luxury beyond her reach. Their elopement scandalized both communities, though for entirely different reasons. The Muggle villagers whispered about impropriety and hasty decisions, speculating about the circumstances that could drive a minister and a well-bred young woman to abandon propriety so completely. Isabel's magical parents, when they learned of her choice, reacted with the kind of horrified fury that only comes from understanding the full implications of what their daughter had done. She hadn't just married a Muggle, she had bound herself to a life of perpetual deception, ensuring that any children she bore would face the same impossible choices that had tormented her throughout her youth. The cottage that became their first home was modest even by the standards of a minister's salary. But Isabel attacked the challenge of making it comfortable with the kind of determination that had served her well during her Hogwarts years. She possessed knowledge that could have made their domestic life far easier, spells that could clean and cook and repair with magical efficiency. But using such abilities would have raised questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Instead, she relied on the practical skills that magical education hadn't emphasized. Learning, through trial and error, to manage a household with nothing more than Muggle tools and fierce determination. The early months of their marriage were blessed with the kind of happiness that justified every risk Isabel had taken to achieve it. Robert proved to be everything she had hoped for in a husband. Gentle, devoted, endlessly patient with her occasional odd behaviors, and mysterious knowledge about subjects that she shouldn't have studied. He attributed her eccentricities to her unusual education and superior intelligence, never imagining that the woman he had married possessed abilities that could have transformed their lives in ways he couldn't begin to comprehend. But happiness built on deception carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. And Isabel knew that eventually she would face moments when maintaining her facade became impossible. The knowledge that she was living a lie colored even her most joyful moments, making her hyper-aware of every gesture and word that might reveal her true nature. She began to feel like an actress playing a role that had become her prison, trapped within an identity that prevented her from expressing the most fundamental aspects of who she truly was. The pregnancy that would produce Minerva came as both blessing and terror, bringing with it the promise of new life and the certainty that her deception would soon become exponentially more complex. Magical children couldn't hide their natures indefinitely. Their abilities manifested in ways that defied rational explanation, creating situations that required either elaborate lies or dangerous revelations. Isabel spent sleepless nights wondering what she would do when her child began displaying the gifts that were her birthright, how she could possibly explain to Robert why their baby could make toys move with her mind, or cause unexplainable phenomena with her emotions. The choice of name became Isabel's first real assertion of her magical heritage since her marriage, a small rebellion against the complete suppression of her identity that her new life demanded. Minerva had been her grandmother's name, a woman of legendary wisdom and strength who had shaped Isabel's understanding of what it meant to be a powerful witch in a world that feared feminine magical authority. The name raised eyebrows in the conservative Muggle community, where classical references were considered pretentious and unusual names were viewed with suspicion. But Isabel held firm against all suggestions for more conventional alternatives. From the moment of her birth, Minerva McGonagall was extraordinary in ways that both thrilled and terrified her mother. The infant possessed an alertness that seemed almost supernatural, tracking movement with eyes that held far too much intelligence for someone who had been in the world for mere days. She rarely cried, but when she did express displeasure, small objects around her crib would tremble or shift position in ways that defied natural explanation. The family cat, a creature that had previously been notable only for its determined laziness, began behaving with the kind of purpose and intelligence that suggested it was responding to commands that no one else could hear. But perhaps the most unsettling manifestation of young Minerva's abilities was her apparent influence over Robert's bagpipes, the musical instruments that were his pride and joy, and his primary means of leading worship services in the village church. The pipes would play themselves in distant rooms of the cottage, producing melodies that were hauntingly beautiful but utterly inexplicable through any conventional understanding of how musical instruments functioned. Robert initially attributed these incidents to wind or acoustic effects he didn't understand. But as they became more frequent and more obviously purposeful, he began to suspect that his home harbored mysteries that his theological training hadn't prepared him to address. Isabel watched these developments with growing anxiety, understanding that each manifestation brought them closer to the moment when her carefully constructed facade would crumble under the weight of undeniable evidence. She tried to suppress Minerva's abilities through careful attention and environmental control, removing potential targets for telekinetic activity and attempting to distract the child whenever signs of magical influence began to appear. But suppressing magic in a child was like trying to dam a river with pebbles. The power would always find ways to express itself, often in forms that were more dramatic and harder to explain than natural development would have produced. The breaking point came when Minerva was still barely old enough to form words. During one of her father's attempts to practice his Sunday sermon in the cottage's main room, the infant, who had been lying quietly in her cot, suddenly began making soft sounds that might have been attempts at speech. As she vocalized, every piece of crockery in the kitchen began to vibrate in harmony with her voice, creating a musical resonance that transformed the cottage into something approaching a musical instrument itself. The effect was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, undeniably magical, and absolutely impossible to explain through any rational framework that Robert possessed. Isabel found her husband standing frozen in the aftermath, staring at their daughter with an expression that mixed wonder, fear, and dawning comprehension. The moment she had dreaded since their wedding day had finally arrived, and there could be no more evasion or postponement. The tears that came as she began her confession were born not just from relief at finally telling the truth, but from the terrible certainty that honesty would destroy the happiness they had built together, that the love which had sustained them both would prove insufficient to bridge the gap between the world Robert knew and the reality that Isabel had concealed from him. The wand that she drew from its hiding place seemed to pulse with magical energy that had been suppressed for too long, eager to be used after months of enforced dormancy. The simple spells she demonstrated were chosen for their obviousness rather than their power, levitation charms that lifted objects with visible force, transfiguration that changed the shape and substance of familiar items, illumination that came from sources that had nothing to do with fire or candles. Each demonstration was accompanied by explanations that sounded like madness to anyone raised in the Muggle world. Descriptions of a society that existed alongside his own, but remained completely hidden from ordinary perception. Robert's reaction was everything Isabel had feared, and more complex than she had expected. The love remained. She could see it in his eyes, unchanged, despite the revelations that had shattered his understanding of reality itself. But alongside love came hurt that went far deeper than simple disappointment. The woman he had married, the person he had trusted with his heart and his future, had built their entire relationship on deception so fundamental that it called into question every memory they shared. How could he trust anything she had ever told him when the most basic facts about her nature had been lies from their first conversation? The theological implications troubled him, perhaps even more than the personal betrayal. Robert was a man whose faith was built on absolute conviction about the nature of divine creation and human capability, whose sermons spoke confidently about God's plan and humanity's place within it. The existence of magic challenged every assumption he had made about how the world functioned, suggesting powers and possibilities that his religious training had never addressed. Was Isabel's magic divine gift or supernatural corruption? Were the abilities she demonstrated evidence of God's grace or signs of forces that existed outside his dominion entirely? But perhaps the cruelest burden was the requirement that he become complicit in deception that violated his most deeply held principles. The statute of secrecy that governed magical society wasn't simply Isabel's personal choice, but legal obligation that could result in memory modification or imprisonment if violated. Keeping her secret meant lying to his congregation, his friends, his family, everyone who trusted him to embody the honesty and transparency that his calling demanded. For a man who had built his identity on being truthful in all things, the requirement to maintain such elaborate falsehoods was torture that Isabel could see eating away at his peace of mind day by day. The months that followed Isabel's revelation were marked by careful adjustment and painful learning for both partners. Robert struggled to reconcile his love for his wife with his growing understanding of how completely she had deceived him, while Isabel battled guilt over the damage her secret had inflicted on the man she adored above all others. Their conversations became stilted affairs, full of careful probing and defensive responses as Robert tried to understand the implications of what he had learned. And Isabel attempted to explain concepts that had no equivalent in his experience. The cottage itself became a stage for ongoing education in the reality of magical existence. Isabel began using her abilities more freely, but always with careful explanation and advance warning that allowed Robert to adjust gradually to phenomena that would have seemed like nightmares if encountered without preparation. She cooked with spells that heated food perfectly without fire, cleaned with charms that made dirt and dust vanish into nothingness, and repaired household items with transfiguration that restored them to better condition than they had ever possessed. These demonstrations were meant to show Robert that magic could be benevolent and practical, but they also highlighted the enormous gap between what she was capable of achieving and what their current life allowed her to express. Every spell was accompanied by explanations of why it had to be hidden from neighbors and friends, why the convenience and efficiency it offered couldn't be shared with people who would benefit enormously from such assistance. The constant awareness that her greatest gifts had to be concealed created a form of intellectual and spiritual claustrophobia that made their cottage feel like a beautiful prison. The pregnancy that would produce Malcolm brought new fears and challenges to parents who were already struggling to maintain equilibrium in a relationship built on necessary deception. One magical child could be managed through careful attention and creative explanation, but two would multiply the complexity exponentially. Moreover, Robert now understood what the strange incidents around Minerva's birth had actually represented, and he faced the prospect of additional children whose abilities might manifest in ways that were even more difficult to conceal or control. Isabel's second pregnancy was marked by the kind of magical instability that sometimes accompanied the bearing of particularly powerful magical children. Objects around her would move without cause, her emotions would influence the local weather patterns, and occasionally she would speak in languages that she had never learned, but which sounded ancient and powerful to anyone who heard them. Robert learned to recognize these episodes and help her manage them through patience and understanding that drew on reserves of compassion he hadn't known he possessed. Malcolm's birth confirmed their fears about the challenges that lay ahead. The infant displayed magical abilities that exceeded even his sister's precocious development, influencing his environment with emotions and desires that remained entirely unconscious but devastatingly effective. His crying could shatter glass when he was truly distressed. His laughter could cause flowers to bloom out of season, and his sleep seemed to calm the very air around him in ways that made the cottage feel like a sanctuary blessed by powers that Robert was only beginning to acknowledge. But it was Minerva's reaction to her new brother that revealed the true scope of the challenges they faced. The 3-year-old displayed protective instincts that manifested through magical abilities she couldn't control or understand, creating shields around Malcolm whenever she perceived threats, and responding to his distress with power that could rearrange furniture or cause walls to glow with soft, comforting light. These manifestations were beautiful but utterly impossible to explain to anyone who didn't understand their magical nature, making every visit from neighbors or parishioners an exercise in careful coordination and strategic distraction. Young Robert's arrival 2 years later completed the family and multiplied their challenges to levels that sometimes seemed overwhelming. 3 magical children in a Muggle household required vigilance and creative problem-solving that exhausted their parents and created constant tension between the life they wanted to live and the life that circumstances forced upon them. Isabel found herself spending enormous amounts of energy suppressing and concealing her children's abilities, while Robert struggled with the daily requirement to lie about the most basic aspects of his family's existence. The village gradually began to notice oddities about the McGonagall family that were difficult to ignore despite everyone's efforts at concealment. Their garden bloomed with unusual abundance, regardless of weather conditions. Their cottage remained comfortable in winter, despite modest heating arrangements. Strange lights were sometimes visible through their windows at night, and unexplained sounds of music drifted from their home when no instruments were being played. These phenomena weren't dramatic enough to cause real investigation, but they contributed to a reputation for eccentricity that set the family apart from their neighbors in ways that made Robert's ministerial duties increasingly awkward. Minerva, as the eldest child, became acutely aware of the tension that defined their household and began taking on responsibilities that no child should have been forced to bear. She learned to recognize the signs that indicated her younger brothers were about to have magical outbursts, developing techniques to distract or calm them before their abilities could manifest in ways that might be noticed. She became expert at creating mundane explanations for magical incidents, crafting stories that were plausible enough to satisfy curious neighbors while protecting her family's secrets. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Minerva's childhood was her gradual understanding of the price that her father paid for maintaining their family's deception. She watched him struggle with sermons that required him to speak about divine truth while concealing the most significant truth in his own life. She saw how he avoided social gatherings where casual conversation might lead to questions he couldn't answer honestly. She observed the way he carried himself like a man bearing invisible burdens that grew heavier with each passing day. Her relationship with Robert became extraordinarily close as a result of this shared understanding. While Isabel dealt with the practical aspects of managing magical children and maintaining their concealment, Robert and Minerva developed emotional bonds that transcended normal parent-child relationships. She became his confidant and ally, the one person who truly understood the moral complexity of their situation and shared his commitment to protecting the family while maintaining some connection to the principles that had once defined his identity. The conversations between father and eldest daughter often took place in the garden during early morning hours, when the younger boys were still sleeping and Isabel was occupied with household tasks that required her magical attention. These talks covered subjects that Robert couldn't discuss with anyone else: his ongoing struggles with the theological implications of magic, his fears about what his children's futures might hold, his growing understanding that love sometimes required compromises that conflicted with every other value a person held dear. Minerva absorbed these lessons with the serious attention that would characterize her entire approach to moral complexity throughout her life. She learned that good people sometimes faced situations where every available choice carried unacceptable costs, that maintaining relationships required flexibility about principles that might seem absolute in simpler circumstances. Most importantly, she understood that her father's willingness to live with contradictions and compromises was motivated by love so deep that it could override every other consideration, a lesson that would guide her own decisions about sacrifice and service for the rest of her life. The family's financial struggles during these years were exacerbated by Robert's growing difficulty in maintaining his ministerial effectiveness while carrying the burden of such extensive deception. His sermons became more philosophical and less concrete. His pastoral counseling sessions were marked by distraction that his parishioners noticed and questioned. Isabel did everything in her power to stretch their limited income through magical assistance that she carefully concealed. But even magic couldn't completely compensate for the professional challenges that Robert faced as his internal conflicts deepened. By the time Minerva approached her 11th birthday and the certainty of receiving her Hogwarts letter, the McGonagall household had achieved a delicate balance that allowed them to function as a family while maintaining their necessary secrets. But this equilibrium was built on suppression and concealment that extracted enormous costs from every family member, creating a home that was filled with love but shadowed by the constant awareness that their happiness depended on perpetual vigilance and careful performance of roles that never felt entirely natural. The letter that would change everything was still months away, but its approach cast shadows that only Isabel fully understood. Once Minerva left for Hogwarts, the family's careful balance would be disrupted in ways that might prove impossible to restore. The magical education that awaited her daughter would provide opportunities and knowledge that Minerva deserved, but it would also create new forms of separation and deception that would test every bond they had struggled so hard to maintain. The letter that arrived on a frost-laden January morning carried the distinctive weight of parchment that had been touched by magic, its envelope bearing an address written in emerald ink that seemed to shimmer with life of its own. Isabel's hands trembled as she recognized the familiar crest of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, the same symbol that had once adorned her own acceptance letter so many years ago, when the world had seemed filled with infinite possibilities rather than impossible choices. She knew that this moment would mark the beginning of the end of their carefully constructed family equilibrium, the first step in a journey that would take her eldest daughter away from the only home she had ever known, and into a world that Isabel had sacrificed everything to leave behind. Minerva's reaction to receiving her Hogwarts letter was everything Isabel had expected and feared in equal measure. The 11-year-old child, who had spent her entire life suppressing her magical abilities and helping to conceal her brother's accidental magic, suddenly found herself faced with official recognition of powers that she had been taught to hide. Her excitement was palpable and heartbreaking. The joy of a young witch finally being acknowledged for what she truly was, mixed with confusion about why this validation had to come at the cost of leaving everything familiar and beloved behind. Robert's response to his daughter's acceptance was complex beyond anything his simple faith had prepared him to handle. Pride in Minerva's obvious intelligence and capability warred with terror about what magical education might do to the thoughtful, principled child he had raised with such care. He understood enough about the wizarding world by now to know that Hogwarts would expose her to concepts and possibilities that would change her fundamentally, creating distances between them that might prove impossible to bridge, regardless of how much love existed on both sides. The months leading up to September 1st were filled with preparations that required Isabel to revisit aspects of magical society that she had hoped never to encounter again. The journey to Diagon Alley necessitated explanations to Robert about the hidden London that existed alongside the city he thought he knew, revelations about magical commerce and society that highlighted how much of her previous life she had concealed from him. Watching her husband struggle to process the reality of a completely parallel civilization existing beneath his notice was almost as painful as preparing to send their daughter into that world alone. The shopping expedition itself was an exercise in careful education for both Robert and Minerva, each discovering different aspects of magical society that challenged their preconceptions and raised new questions about identity and belonging. For Robert, the casual displays of magic in shop windows and the matter-of-fact discussions of spells and potions represented a complete reimagining of what reality contained. For Minerva, the sight of other magical families shopping for school supplies provided her first real understanding that she wasn't alone in possessing abilities that had always seemed to isolate her from ordinary children. The one selection at Ollivander's proved to be particularly significant, not just for the obvious reasons, but for what it revealed about Minerva's character and potential. The 9.5-inch wand of fir wood with a dragon heartstring core that chose her was known for its strength and reliability, its affinity for transfiguration work, and its tendency to bond with witches and wizards who possessed both intellectual brilliance and unshakable moral principles. Mr. Ollivander's cryptic comments about the wand's previous owner and its potential for great achievements sent shivers through Isabel, who understood enough about wand lore to recognize that her daughter was destined for significance that would extend far beyond ordinary magical education. The train journey to Hogwarts represented Minerva's first real separation from her family and her first opportunity to interact with other magical children without the constant awareness that her abilities had to be concealed. The compartment she shared with students from various magical backgrounds provided her with perspectives on wizarding life that her isolated upbringing had never offered, exposing her to the casual assumptions and cultural knowledge that pure-blood and half-blood children took for granted. She discovered that her unusual background, the daughter of a witch and muggle who had grown up understanding both worlds, gave her insights that her new friends found fascinating and occasionally enviable. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the journey was Minerva's growing understanding that Hogwarts represented more than education. It was sanctuary, a place where magical children could express their true natures without fear or concealment. For someone who had spent 11 years helping to manage her family's elaborate deception, the prospect of living openly as a witch felt almost too wonderful to believe. Yet alongside this excitement came guilt about leaving her parents to manage Malcolm and Robert Jr.'s magical development without her assistance, and worry about how her father would cope with the theological challenges that her absence might intensify rather than resolve. The arrival at Hogwarts Castle exceeded every expectation that Minerva had developed during her months of anticipation. The ancient stones seemed to pulse with accumulated magic from centuries of education and achievement, while the very air carried traces of spells and enchantments that made her skin tingle with recognition of power beyond anything she had previously experienced. The sight of older students using magic casually and openly, without the careful concealment that had defined her entire previous existence, was simultaneously thrilling and overwhelming for someone whose understanding of magical expression had been shaped by necessity for secrecy. The Great Hall, with its enchanted ceiling that reflected the star-filled sky above, represented everything that magical education promised. Wonder, combined with learning, beauty enhanced by knowledge, tradition maintained through generations of students who had sat beneath the same stars and felt the same mixture of excitement and terror about the futures that awaited them. But for Minerva, the ceremony also carried additional weight because she understood, in ways that many of her fellow first years did not, exactly what she was choosing and what she was leaving behind through her presence at Hogwarts. The Sorting Hat's deliberation over her placement became legendary among her classmates, not just for its duration, but for the obvious difficulty that the ancient magical artifact experienced in determining where her talents and character would be best served. 5.5 minutes was an eternity in Sorting Hat terms, long enough for the entire hall to grow restless, and for Minerva herself to begin wondering if some fundamental flaw in her character was preventing proper classification. The Hat's internal debate between Gryffindor and Ravenclaw reflected the genuine complexity of her nature, brilliant enough for the House of Wit and Learning, but possessed of courage and moral conviction that demanded the House of the Brave. The final decision in favor of Gryffindor was made not because her intellectual gifts were insufficient for Ravenclaw, but because the Sorting Hat recognized in her the kind of principled bravery that would be needed in the dark times that lay ahead. The Hat's ancient wisdom detected traces of the moral courage that had driven her father to accept magical reality despite his theological struggles, combined with her mother's fierce protectiveness and enhanced by intellectual capabilities that would allow her to serve both justice and knowledge with equal dedication. Her first weeks at Hogwarts were marked by the kind of academic excellence that surprised no one who had observed her careful, methodical approach to everything she encountered. But beyond mere grade achievement, Minerva demonstrated the kind of comprehensive understanding that came from years of observing magical phenomena without being able to study them formally. Her questions in class revealed depths of practical knowledge that impressed professors and sometimes unsettled classmates who couldn't understand how someone from her background could possess such sophisticated insights into magical theory and application. Transfiguration, taught by the brilliant young Professor Albus Dumbledore, became immediately and obviously her greatest strength. The subject that many students found challenging to the point of impossibility seemed almost intuitive to Minerva, as if she possessed innate understanding of the fundamental principles that governed the transformation of matter and energy through magical intervention. Her first successful transfiguration, changing a match into a needle with precision that exceeded anything Dumbledore had seen from a first-year student, marked the beginning of a tutorial relationship that would shape both their destinies in ways neither could have anticipated. But it wasn't just her magical abilities that set Minerva apart from her classmates. The years spent navigating the complex moral terrain of her family's situation had developed in her a maturity and perspective that most 11-year-olds simply didn't possess. She understood that choices carried consequences that extended far beyond immediate gratification, that loyalty sometimes required sacrifice, and that truth wasn't always simple or comfortable. These insights made her a natural leader among her peers, someone who could see beyond surface appearances to understand the deeper implications of actions and decisions. Her friendship with Pomona Sprout, a cheerful Hufflepuff girl with an infectious love of magical plants and growing things, provided Minerva with her first real experience of uncomplicated companionship with someone her own age. Pomona's straightforward nature and genuine warmth created a refuge from the intellectual intensity that characterized most of Minerva's interactions, while her different house affiliation allowed their friendship to develop without the competitive pressures that sometimes strained relationships within Gryffindor itself. The friendship was built on mutual respect and complementary strengths, rather than simple similarity of interests or background. Where Minerva excelled in precise magical theory and complex spellwork, Pomona possessed intuitive understanding of living magical systems and the patient nurturing that allowed her to coax extraordinary growth and beauty from even the most challenging magical plants. Their study sessions became collaborations that enhanced both their educations, with Minerva providing theoretical frameworks that helped Pomona understand the magical principles underlying her practical successes, while Pomona offered perspectives on magical ecology and natural harmony that enriched Minerva's understanding of transfiguration applications. But perhaps the most significant aspect of their friendship was the way it demonstrated to Minerva that magical education could create bonds that transcended the house divisions that seemed so important to other students. The artificial competition between Gryffindor and Hufflepuff meant nothing compared to the genuine connection between two young witches who respected each other's talents and supported each other's growth, a lesson that would influence Minerva's approach to both teaching and administration throughout her career. Her academic performance during first year established patterns that would continue throughout her Hogwarts education. Not just excellence, but the kind of comprehensive mastery that came from understanding subjects at fundamental levels, rather than simply memorizing information for examinations. Her essays were models of clear thinking and thorough research that other students sought to emulate, while her practical demonstrations showed creativity and precision that impressed even professors who had seen decades of talented students pass through their classrooms. Defense against the dark arts, taught by a competent but uninspiring professor who focused primarily on theory rather than practical application, failed to challenge Minerva in ways that revealed her potential in the subject. However, her performance in written examinations and her thoughtful questions during lectures demonstrated understanding of dark magic and its counters that would later prove invaluable during the dangerous times that lay ahead. She approached the subject with the same methodical thoroughness that characterized all her academic work, but also with awareness that came from growing up in a household where concealment of magical abilities was literally a matter of survival. Potions, under the demanding Professor Slughorn, provided Minerva with her first experience of magical education that required not just intellectual understanding, but precise technique and careful attention to detail that could mean the difference between success and dangerous failure. Her background of watching her mother brew household remedies and protective potions gave her practical foundation that many pure-blood students lacked, while her naturally meticulous nature ensured that her cauldron work met even Slughorn's exacting standards. The potions professor's famous collection of talented students, his Slug Club, extended its invitation to Minerva early in her second year. Recognition of abilities that went beyond simple academic achievement to encompass the kind of potential that Slughorn had learned to identify in students who might achieve significant positions in magical society. The monthly gatherings provided her with exposure to older students whose ambitions and achievements offered glimpses of possible futures that her isolated childhood had never allowed her to imagine. Charms, taught by the diminutive but brilliant Professor Flitwick, became another area of particular strength for Minerva, though her approach to the subject reflected her systematic nature rather than the intuitive flair that characterized some of her more artistically inclined classmates. She mastered the wand movements and incantations with mechanical precision that ensured consistent results, but she also demonstrated theoretical understanding that allowed her to modify and improve standard charms in ways that impressed even Professor Flitwick's considerable expertise. Her success in charms was built on the same foundation that supported all her magical education: the understanding that magic was fundamentally about precision, control, and clear intention rather than raw power or dramatic flourishes. The years spent helping to conceal her family's magical activities had taught her that the most effective magic was often the most subtle, achieving desired results without drawing unwanted attention or creating unintended consequences. By her third year, Minerva had established herself not just as the most outstanding student of her year, but as someone whose potential seemed unlimited by conventional standards. Her professors began discussing her progress in terms usually reserved for students who appeared once in a generation, while her classmates looked to her for guidance and support that she provided with the same careful attention she brought to everything else in her life. The appointment as prefect in her 5th year was recognition of leadership qualities that extended far beyond academic achievement. Her fellow Gryffindors had learned to trust her judgment and rely on her support, while students from other houses respected her fairness and willingness to help anyone who approached her with genuine need for assistance. The badge of office felt like natural extension of responsibilities she had already been shouldering informally, confirmation that her careful approach to balancing individual needs with larger obligations was valued by the school's administration. Her prefect duties were conducted with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized all her work, but also with understanding that rules existed to serve students rather than to create arbitrary barriers to their success. She learned to distinguish between infractions that required firm correction and those that could be addressed through explanation and guidance, developing the flexible but principled approach to authority that would later make her such an effective head of house and eventually headmistress. The selection as head girl in her 7th year was both honor and burden. Recognition of her outstanding character and abilities, but also acknowledgement that she possessed the rare combination of intelligence, integrity, and judgment that made her trustworthy with responsibilities that could significantly impact other students' educational experiences. The position required her to work closely with the head boy and prefects from all 4 houses, developing diplomatic and administrative skills that complemented her already formidable academic abilities. Her academic awards during these final years included the Transfiguration Today Most Promising Newcomer Award, recognition from the premier professional journal in her chosen field that she possessed potential that extended far beyond student achievement into possible contributions to magical knowledge itself. The award came with invitation to submit research proposals and access to advanced texts that weren't normally available to students, opportunities that Minerva pursued with enthusiasm that reflected her growing understanding that she might want to dedicate her career to magical education rather than pursuing more conventional career paths. But it was her achievement in Quidditch that provided some of the most intense and memorable experiences of her Hogwarts years, demonstrating that her talents extended beyond purely academic pursuits into areas that required physical coordination, strategic thinking, and ability to perform under pressure that could be quite literally life-threatening. Her natural grace and competitive spirit made her a formidable player whose skills developed rapidly once she gained access to proper training and equipment. The position of team captain in her final year was earned through demonstrated leadership, both on and off the pitch, but also through tactical understanding that allowed her to develop strategies that maximized her teammates' strengths while minimizing their weaknesses. Her approach to Quidditch reflected the same analytical mindset that served her well in academic subjects, but enhanced by passion and emotional investment that revealed aspects of her character that classroom work couldn't fully express. The match that would leave her with permanent injuries and lifelong animosity towards Slytherin began as routine inter-house competition, but escalated into something approaching warfare when the opposing team's beater deliberately targeted her with a bludger that had been doctored to be more aggressive and harder to detect than regulation equipment should have allowed. The illegal modification turned what should have been challenging but safe sporting contest into potentially lethal assault that only her quick reflexes and considerable skill prevented from being fatal. The impact, when it finally came despite her evasive maneuvers, was devastating in ways that went beyond simple physical injury. The concussion left her unconscious for nearly 24 hours, during which time the Hogwarts medical staff worked frantically to ensure that the magical trauma didn't cause permanent damage to her mental faculties. The broken ribs required weeks of careful healing that was complicated by the magical nature of her injuries, while the internal damage took months to fully repair and left her with occasional weakness that would persist throughout her adult life. But perhaps the most significant consequence of the attack was the way it crystallized her understanding of the difference between fair competition and malicious assault disguised as sport. The Slytherin team's refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing, their claims that the injury was simply an unfortunate accident that occurred during normal play, demonstrated a casual disregard for truth and responsibility that violated everything Minerva valued about honest competition and mutual respect. The incident also revealed the depth of support and affection that she had earned from students throughout the school, as representatives from all 4 houses visited her in the hospital wing and expressed outrage at the underhanded tactics that had caused her injuries. Even some Slytherin students privately condemned their house team's behavior, though their criticism remained whispered rather than public due to the complex dynamics of house loyalty and pureblood social pressures. Her recovery was marked by determination that impressed even the experienced medical staff who had treated countless Quidditch injuries over the years. Instead of allowing the trauma to diminish her love of flying or competitive spirit, Minerva used the enforced rest period to study advanced Quidditch strategy and develop training methods that would help future Gryffindor teams avoid similar injuries while maintaining the aggressive style that made them competitive. Against opponents who might be willing to bend or break rules, the return to the pitch for her final matches was triumphant in ways that went beyond simple athletic achievement, demonstrating that courage meant continuing to pursue excellence, despite risks that had already proven themselves capable of causing serious harm. Her teammates drew inspiration from her resilience, while opposing teams learned that attempting to intimidate her through physical threat was more likely to strengthen her resolve than weaken her performance. But it was the culmination of her academic career, the achievement of animagus transformation under Professor Dumbledore's guidance, that represented the true pinnacle of her Hogwarts education. The ability to transform into animal form was so difficult and dangerous that most adult wizards never attempted it, requiring not just magical power, but the kind of precise control and absolute concentration that could be maintained throughout the lengthy and hazardous transformation process. The choice of cat form was both practical and symbolic, reflecting Minerva's natural grace and independence, but also her fierce protective instincts and ability to move silently when observation or stealth was required. The tabby markings around her eyes that exactly matched her spectacles provided a distinctive identifier that would later become famous throughout the wizarding world, while her retained intelligence in animal form made her capable of sophisticated surveillance and communication. that proved invaluable during both her teaching career and the dangerous times when such abilities could mean the difference between life and death. The actual achievement of first transformation was preceded by months of preparation that tested every aspect of her magical education and personal character. The theoretical knowledge required was enormous, encompassing not just transfiguration theory but also medical magic, animal behavior, magical law, and psychological preparation that addressed the risks of losing human identity during the transformation process. The practical requirements were even more demanding, requiring her to maintain perfect magical control while experiencing physical and mental changes that challenged every assumption about personal identity and bodily integrity. Professor Dumbledore's guidance during this process revealed aspects of his teaching that went far beyond conventional classroom instruction, demonstrating the kind of individual attention and personal investment that he reserved for students whose potential extended beyond normal educational goals. His patient explanation of each stage of the process was complemented by philosophical discussions about the nature of identity and transformation that prepared Minerva not just for the magical challenges she would face, but for the psychological adaptation required to successfully integrate animal and human aspects of her consciousness. The first successful transformation was simultaneously the most terrifying and most liberating experience of Minerva's young life, representing mastery of magic that exceeded anything she had previously achieved, while also providing her with capabilities that opened entirely new possibilities for her future service and contribution to the wizarding world. The feeling of moving through the world with feline grace and enhanced senses was intoxicating, but also required careful discipline to ensure that human consciousness remained dominant and capable of making rational decisions about when and how to use these new abilities. But perhaps the most significant aspect of achieving animagus status was what it revealed about the relationship that had developed between Minerva and Professor Dumbledore over the course of her education. His willingness to guide her through such advanced and potentially dangerous magic demonstrated not just confidence in her abilities, but personal investment in her development that went beyond normal teacher-student relationships. Their work together on the transformation created bonds of mutual respect and trust that would influence both their lives in ways that neither could have anticipated during those long hours of preparation and practice. The registration process with the Ministry of Magic that followed her successful transformation was Minerva's first official interaction with magical government, providing her with insights into wizarding bureaucracy and law that would later prove valuable during her career in education and her involvement in resistance activities. The careful documentation of her animagus form and the legal requirements that governed its use were lessons in both the protections and limitations that magical law provided to those who possessed unusual abilities. As her 7th year drew to a close and graduation approached, Minerva found herself facing choices about her future that would define not just her career but her entire approach to life and service. The academic excellence she had demonstrated throughout her Hogwarts years had opened doors to opportunities that her childhood circumstances had never allowed her to imagine, but they had also created expectations and responsibilities that would require her to choose between personal desires and larger obligations to the magical community that had nurtured her development. The offers that arrived from various magical institutions and government departments were recognition of achievements that placed her among the most promising graduates in Hogwarts history, but they were also reminders that exceptional ability created exceptional responsibility. The choices she made about which opportunities to pursue would influence not just her own destiny, but the lives of countless others who might benefit from her knowledge, skills, and commitment to justice and educational excellence. But beneath all the external recognition and future possibilities lay the deeper question of identity and belonging that had shaped her entire educational experience. 7 years at Hogwarts had transformed her from a young witch who had spent her childhood concealing her abilities into someone who could use magic with confidence and creativity that exceeded most adult wizards' capabilities. Yet the same education that had liberated her from the constraints of her unusual upbringing had also created new forms of responsibility and obligation that would require her to continue choosing between personal fulfillment and service to others who needed her unique combination of abilities and character. The young woman who would soon leave Hogwarts Castle had been shaped by every aspect of her magical education, the academic challenges that had developed her intellectual capabilities, the friendships that had taught her about loyalty and cooperation, the competitions that had revealed her courage and determination, and most importantly, the recognition that exceptional ability carried with it exceptional responsibility to use those gifts in service of justice and protection for those who possessed lesser advantages or faced greater dangers. Standing at the threshold between student life and adult responsibility, Minerva McGonagall embodied the finest achievements that magical education could produce. Not just knowledge and skill, but wisdom and character that would serve the wizarding world through decades of challenge and change. The foundation had been laid for a life of service that would touch countless students and colleagues, but also for the personal sacrifices and difficult choices that such dedication would inevitably require. The letter that arrived from the Ministry of Magic on a crisp morning in late June carried the distinctive seal of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, its heavy parchment, speaking of opportunities that most recent Hogwarts graduates could only dream of receiving. Minerva held the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from the profound realization that this moment represented the culmination of 7 years of exceptional achievement and the beginning of choices that would define the rest of her life. The offer contained within was everything her professors had predicted: recognition of her outstanding abilities, invitation to join the most prestigious department in magical government, and the promise of a career that could influence the very foundations of wizarding society. The position offered was in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, working directly with the most complex and dangerous cases that required not just magical skill, but the kind of analytical brilliance and unshakable moral courage that her Hogwarts record had demonstrated in abundance. The salary mentioned was generous beyond anything her family had ever enjoyed, promising financial security that could transform not just her own circumstances, but potentially provide support for her parents and younger brothers, whose magical education would soon require resources that a minister's modest income could never adequately supply. But perhaps most significantly, the letter represented validation that her unusual background, the daughter of a witch and muggle who understood both worlds intimately, was viewed as an asset rather than a limitation by those who made decisions about the place for low future of magical law enforcement. Her unique perspective, combined with her demonstrated abilities in transfiguration and her natural leadership qualities, made her exactly the kind of recruit that the ministry needed as it faced increasingly complex challenges in maintaining the delicate balance between magical and muggle societies. The decision to return home for one final summer before beginning her adult career was made not from hesitation about accepting the ministry position, but from understanding that this transition represented more than simply changing locations or responsibilities. She was moving from the protected environment of Hogwarts, where her achievements had been celebrated and her potential nurtured, into a world where her abilities would be tested against real dangers, and her character would be measured against consequences that extended far beyond academic grades or house point totals. The McGonagall cottage had changed subtly during her 7 years of education, reflecting the gradual adjustment that her family had made to life with two magical sons whose abilities required constant attention and careful management. Malcolm, now 13, displayed the kind of raw magical power that made accidental magic a daily concern, while 9-year-old Robert Jr. possessed a more subtle but equally challenging gift for influencing the emotions and thoughts of people around him. Her parents had aged in ways that reflected not just the passage of time, but the accumulated stress of maintaining their elaborate deception while raising children, whose very existence challenged every assumption their community held about the nature of reality. Isabel's reaction to seeing her daughter after months of separation was a mixture of pride and melancholy that revealed how much the years of maintaining magical secrecy had cost the entire family. The brilliant young witch who had returned to them bore little resemblance to the serious child who had departed for Hogwarts 7 years earlier. Transformed by education and experience into someone whose confidence and capabilities exceeded anything their isolated household had prepared them to understand. Yet beneath her obvious achievements lay traces of the same thoughtful, principled character that had made her such an essential part of their family's careful balance. Robert's greeting was more complex, tinged with the theological questions that had never fully resolved during Minerva's absence. Watching his eldest daughter demonstrate casual mastery of magic that exceeded anything he had witnessed from Isabel forced him to confront once again the reality that his children possessed, abilities that his faith struggled to categorize or accept. Yet his love for Minerva remained unchanged, perhaps even deepened by recognition that her achievements represented triumph over circumstances that might have destroyed someone with less strength of character. The summer that followed was intended to be a peaceful transition between student life and adult responsibility, but it became instead a season of profound personal discovery that would influence every subsequent choice in Minerva's life. The village that had seemed so small and constraining during her childhood now felt like sanctuary, where she could explore aspects of her identity that Hogwarts had never addressed, particularly the question of how someone who moved easily between magical and muggle worlds might forge connections that transcended the careful boundaries that had always defined her family's existence. It was during one of her solitary walks through the countryside that surrounded their cottage that Minerva first encountered Dougal McGregor, the young man who would challenge every assumption she had made about her future and force her to confront the same impossible choices that had shaped her parents' entire marriage. He was everything that her magical education had taught her to view as foreign and irrelevant. A muggle farmer's son, whose concerns revolved around crops and weather rather than spells and potions, whose knowledge was grounded in soil and seasons rather than books and theories. Yet their first conversation revealed depths of intelligence and character that transcended the artificial boundaries between magical and non-magical education. Dougal possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from close observation of natural systems, understanding of cause and effect that was based on experience rather than theory, and most dangerously, a genuine curiosity about the world that made him ask questions that most people would have been satisfied to leave unanswered. His interest in Minerva herself seemed refreshingly uncomplicated by the reputation and expectations that had followed her throughout her Hogwarts years. The attraction that developed between them over the course of long summer days was unlike anything Minerva had experienced during her school years, when romantic interests had been limited to fellow students whose magical abilities and career ambitions created comfortable common ground for relationships that never challenged fundamental assumptions about identity or future possibilities. Dougal represented something entirely different, the chance to explore aspects of herself that magical education had never addressed, to discover whether the person she became, when not defined by her exceptional abilities, might be capable of the kind of simple happiness that her parents had briefly achieved before the weight of necessary deception made their love source of constant pain. Their courtship unfolded with the lazy inevitability of summer itself, each encounter deepening connections that neither fully understood but both found impossible to resist. Minerva discovered that concealing her magical abilities from someone she was growing to care for required different skills than the family-wide deception that had characterized her childhood, where her parents' secret had been maintained through careful coordination and mutual support. Her developing relationship with Dougal required her to constantly monitor her own behavior, suppressing reflexes and knowledge that had become fundamental aspects of her identity. The challenge was made more complex by Dougal's obvious intelligence and perceptive nature, qualities that made him likely to notice inconsistencies or unexplained knowledge that less observant companions might have overlooked entirely. His questions about her education and future plans required creative responses that contained enough truth to satisfy his curiosity while concealing the fundamental reality of what she was and what she was capable of achieving. The constant mental effort of maintaining such elaborate deception was exhausting in ways that her family's shared burden had never been. Yet the emotional rewards of the relationship were equally intense, providing Minerva with her first taste of being valued for qualities that had nothing to do with magical achievement or academic excellence. Dougal's interest in her thoughts and opinions was based on genuine appreciation for her intelligence and character, rather than awe at her exceptional abilities. Their discussions of literature, philosophy, and the natural world revealed compatibility that went beyond surface attraction to encompass shared values and complementary perspectives that enriched both their understandings. The physical aspects of their relationship developed with careful respect for boundaries that both understood intuitively, though for different reasons. Dougal's restraint was based on conventional morality and genuine care for Minerva's reputation, while her caution reflected understanding that magical teenagers faced risks and complications that Muggle relationships never encountered. The intensity of their emotional connection was sufficient to make physical restraint increasingly difficult, creating pressure that added urgency to questions about the relationship's ultimate direction. But perhaps the most significant aspect of their growing bond was the way it forced Minerva to confront questions about identity and belonging that her magical education had never adequately addressed. At Hogwarts, she had been defined primarily by her exceptional abilities and academic achievements, celebrated for qualities that set her apart from ordinary students and prepared her for extraordinary responsibilities. With Dougal, she experienced the novelty of being appreciated for more fundamental human qualities: kindness, humor, intellectual curiosity, and emotional depth that had nothing to do with magic. The contrast was both liberating and terrifying, offering glimpses of alternative futures that her career planning had never considered, while also highlighting the enormous sacrifices that such choices would require. A life with Dougal would mean abandoning the opportunities that her magical education had opened, relegating her exceptional abilities to the kind of careful concealment that had defined her childhood, rather than using them in service of the larger wizarding community that needed people with her talents and dedication. The proposal, when it finally came during a perfect August evening that seemed designed by nature itself to encourage romantic gestures, was everything that Minerva could have hoped for in terms of heartfelt sincerity and genuine devotion. Dougal's words were simple but profound, expressing not just love but recognition of the remarkable person she had revealed herself to be during their months of growing intimacy. His vision of their future together was painted in terms that emphasized partnership, mutual support, and the kind of quiet happiness that came from building a life based on shared values and complementary strengths. Her immediate acceptance was driven by emotions that overwhelmed the careful analytical thinking that had characterized every other major decision in her life. In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the Scottish countryside, and moved by the obvious depth of Dougal's feelings, the logical objections and practical obstacles that should have given her pause simply disappeared before the power of genuine love offered and gratefully received. The ring he slipped onto her finger was simple but perfect, its modest diamond reflecting starlight that seemed to promise futures filled with the kind of uncomplicated joy that her family's complex circumstances had never allowed her to experience directly. But love, however genuine and powerful, cannot permanently suppress the kind of analytical intelligence that had made Minerva exceptional throughout her academic career. As she walked home through familiar countryside that now seemed transformed by the promise of a completely different future, her mind began processing the practical implications of the commitment she had just made. The engagement that had felt so natural and right during the emotional intensity of the proposal now required examination of consequences that extended far beyond her own happiness, to encompass obligations and opportunities that affected not just her but countless others who might benefit from her unique abilities. The sleepless night that followed was spent in the kind of thorough analysis that her professors would have recognized as characteristic of her approach to any complex problem, but applied to personal circumstances that made objective evaluation nearly impossible. Every aspect of the relationship and its potential consequences was examined with merciless honesty that revealed both the genuine love that existed between her and Dougal and the fundamental incompatibilities that made their marriage an en fait act of mutual cruelty disguised as romantic fulfillment. The parallels to her parents' situation were impossible to ignore, though in some ways her circumstances were even more challenging than those that had faced Isabel and Robert. Her mother had been a talented witch, but not an exceptional one, capable of building a reasonably satisfying life within the constraints that marriage to a Muggle imposed. Minerva's abilities and the opportunities they represented were on an entirely different scale, making the sacrifice required for such a marriage correspondingly greater and more permanent. The ministry position that awaited her in London was not simply a career opportunity, but a chance to use her talents in service of justice and protection for magical and Muggle communities alike. The work would be demanding and dangerous, requiring exactly the kind of analytical brilliance and unshakable moral courage that her Hogwarts education had developed. Abandoning such opportunities for domestic happiness, however genuine, would represent a betrayal not just of her own potential, but of the investment that had been made in her development by professors and institutions that deserved better return on their commitment to her growth. But the personal costs of her marriage would extend far beyond career limitations to encompass the fundamental dishonesty that would poison every aspect of their relationship. The deception required would be even more extensive than what her parents had maintained, because Dougal's intelligence and perceptive nature made him more likely to notice inconsistencies and unexplained behaviors. Living such a lie would require her to suppress not just her magical abilities, but essential aspects of her personality and knowledge that had been shaped by 7 years of magical education. The children that would inevitably result from their marriage would face the same impossible circumstances that had defined her own childhood, forced to choose between honesty with their father and protection of their mother's secret. The cycle of deception and concealment would continue into another generation, creating new victims of circumstances that were essentially unfair to everyone involved. Her love for Dougal was genuine, but love alone was insufficient foundation for a relationship that would require one partner to live in constant fear of discovery, while the other remained ignorant of the most fundamental truths about the person he had married. The theological implications that would affect Dougal were equally troubling, as Minerva had witnessed firsthand through her father's ongoing struggles with the moral complexity of maintaining magical secrecy. A man whose faith was built on absolute commitment to honesty and transparency would be destroyed by the requirement to participate in elaborate deception, even when that deception was motivated by love rather than selfish interest. The damage to Dougal's fundamental sense of identity and moral integrity would be a form of cruelty that no amount of genuine affection could justify or ameliorate. Perhaps most painfully, Minerva recognized that her acceptance of the proposal had been driven by the same escape fantasy that had motivated her mother's elopement. The dream that love could overcome practical obstacles, and that happiness could be achieved through pure force of will and commitment. But her parents' marriage had demonstrated the ultimate inadequacy of such thinking, showing how even genuine love could be poisoned by circumstances that made honesty impossible and authentic intimacy a casualty of necessary protective deception. The dawn that ended her night of agonizing self-examination brought not resolution but the clear understanding that her choice was between two forms of betrayal: betraying Dougal by marrying him under false pretenses, or betraying him by breaking the engagement without explanation that would satisfy his obvious intelligence and emotional investment in their relationship. Neither option was acceptable by normal standards of decent behavior, but circumstances had conspired to make decent behavior impossible, regardless of which path she ultimately chose. The conversation that shattered both their hearts was conducted with the kind of clinical precision that protected Minerva from complete emotional breakdown while inflicting maximum damage on the man she genuinely loved. Her explanation that she had reconsidered the engagement and realized that their differences were too great to overcome was truthful in ways that Dougal couldn't possibly understand, while being completely inadequate as justification for abandoning promises that had been made with obvious sincerity just hours earlier. Dougal's reaction was everything that her guilty conscience had feared: incomprehension giving way to pain, pain transforming into desperate attempts to understand what had changed so suddenly, and finally the kind of dignified acceptance that made her love him even more, while confirming that ending their relationship was the only choice that offered any hope of protecting him from worse suffering in the future. His final words, that he would always love her and hope that she might someday reconsider, were torture that she endured because the alternative was explanation that would destroy not just their relationship, but potentially his entire understanding of reality itself. The 3 days that elapsed between ending her engagement and departing for London were filled with the kind of emotional numbness that provided temporary protection against grief too profound to process immediately. Her family, recognizing signs of heartbreak but respecting her obvious need for privacy, offered support through presence rather than questions. Understanding that some wounds required solitude for proper healing, the packing that occupied her hands left her mind free to circle endlessly through memories and regrets that would haunt her for decades to come. The journey to London was her first extended travel as an adult, providing welcome distraction through new sights and experiences that demanded attention outside her own emotional turmoil. The magical districts of the capital that had seemed so exciting during her Hogwarts shopping expeditions now appeared as simply the practical framework for the adult life she had chosen over the domestic happiness that Dougal had offered. The contrast between her current circumstances and the alternative future she had abandoned was stark enough to make her question whether she had made the right choice. Even though rational analysis continued to confirm that marriage would have been disaster for everyone involved. The flat that the ministry had arranged for her was comfortable but impersonal, reflecting the institutional approach to housing that prioritized functionality over warmth or individual expression. The furnished rooms were adequate for her immediate needs, but lacked any trace of the character that might have made them feel like home rather than temporary accommodation. The silence that filled the space during evening hours was particularly oppressive, providing too much opportunity for reflection on roads not taken and happiness deliberately abandoned. Her new position in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement proved to be everything the recruitment letter had promised in terms of intellectual challenge and meaningful work, but the emotional rewards were complicated by her continuing grief over the sacrifice that her career had demanded. The cases that crossed her desk were genuinely important, requiring exactly the kind of analytical brilliance and attention to detail that made her exceptional, but her heart remained divided between professional satisfaction and personal loss that colored even her greatest successes with shades of melancholy. The colleagues who welcomed her to the department were competent professionals whose expertise and dedication made them pleasant to work alongside, but many held attitudes toward Muggle society that made casual conversation an exercise in careful diplomacy rather than genuine friendship. The casual dismissal of non-magical people as inferior or irrelevant was particularly painful for someone whose father was Muggle and whose recent heartbreak had been caused precisely by the artificial barriers that separated magical and non-magical communities. But it was her relationship with her supervisor, Elphinstone Urquhart, that provided the first genuine bright spot in her London experience, offering the kind of intellectual partnership and personal respect that made her professional achievements feel meaningful rather than simply adequate. Urquhart was everything that an ideal mentor should be: brilliant without being condescending, demanding without being unfair, committed to excellence in ways that inspired rather than intimidated those who worked under his direction. Their professional collaboration developed quickly into mutual respect that transcended normal workplace relationships, based on recognition that they shared not just intellectual abilities but fundamental values about the purpose and conduct of magical law enforcement. Urquhart's approach to their work emphasized justice over expedience, thorough investigation over quick conclusions, and protection of both magical and Muggle communities, rather than advancing pure-blood supremacist agendas that influenced too many ministry policies. The 2 years that Minerva spent in this position established her reputation within the ministry as someone whose analytical abilities and unshakable integrity made her invaluable for the most complex and sensitive cases. Her reports were models of thorough research and clear thinking that other departments began requesting for their own difficult situations. Her testimony in administrative hearings and legal proceedings was regarded as unimpeachable, based on investigation techniques that left no room for doubt or misinterpretation. Yet professional success could not fill the emotional void that her sacrifice had created, and her personal life remained largely empty despite the intellectual satisfaction that her career provided. The London social scene held little appeal for someone whose heart remained in Scotland, while the eligible wizards who expressed interest in courtship seemed shallow compared to the man whose honest love she had abandoned for duty and principle. She began to understand why her mother had sometimes seemed so melancholy during her childhood, recognizing the particular form of grief that came from choosing responsibility over happiness, with full knowledge of what was being sacrificed. The prestigious promotion that was offered after 2 years of exemplary service represented recognition of achievements that exceeded the most optimistic expectations anyone had held for even someone with her exceptional background. The position would have provided substantial salary increase, significantly enhanced authority, and opportunity to influence ministry policy at levels usually reserved for wizards with decades of experience. The offer was accompanied by personal congratulations from department heads who rarely noticed individual employees. making acceptance seem like natural next step in a career that was progressing even more rapidly than her most ambitious projections had anticipated. Yet the decision to decline the promotion and request transfer to Hogwarts was made not from dissatisfaction with her current work, but from recognition that her true calling lay in education, rather than law enforcement, in nurturing the next generation of magical talent. Rather than pursuing criminals who represented the failures of previous educational systems, the letter she composed to Albus Dumbledore was both professional inquiry and personal plea, requesting opportunity to return to the castle that had shaped her character and to dedicate her abilities to work that would honor the investment that had been made in her own development. The response that arrived within hours was everything she could have hoped for. Not just acceptance, but enthusiasm from the professor who had guided her through her most advanced magical achievements and who understood better than anyone else the scope of her capabilities and the depth of her commitment to educational excellence. The offer of a position in the Transfiguration Department came directly from Dumbledore himself, accompanied by terms that reflected recognition of her exceptional qualifications and his personal confidence in her potential as an educator. The decision represented more than career change, but homecoming to the place and purpose that had always defined her deepest identity and aspirations. London had provided valuable experience and professional achievement that would enhance her effectiveness as a teacher, but Hogwarts offered the chance to use her abilities in service of work that aligned perfectly with her values and long-term goals. The castle that had nurtured her development would now benefit from her knowledge and dedication, creating the kind of meaningful reciprocal relationship that made career satisfaction possible at the deepest levels. The resignation letter she submitted to the ministry was received with disappointment by colleagues who had expected her to become one of the department's most influential leaders, but also with understanding from those who recognized that exceptional talent sometimes required unconventional career paths to achieve its full potential. Elphinstone Urquhart's response was particularly gracious, acknowledging that educational work represented the highest form of public service, while expressing hope that their professional relationship might continue through future collaboration on cases that required both ministry resources and Hogwarts expertise. But perhaps the most significant aspect of leaving London was the recognition that her brief career in magical law enforcement had provided her with perspectives and experiences that would make her a more effective educator than she could have become through any other path. Understanding how magical law worked in practice, witnessing the consequences of inadequate education in handling magical power, and developing appreciation for the complex relationships between magical and Muggle communities would inform her teaching in ways that purely academic preparation could never have achieved. The return journey to Scotland was filled with anticipation rather than the melancholy that had characterized her departure, though the landscape that passed outside her compartment window inevitably brought memories of Dougal and the happiness she had sacrificed for duty. The choice still seemed correct by every rational measure, but the emotional costs remained painful despite the passage of time and the satisfaction that professional achievement had provided. Some wounds healed but left permanent scars that served as reminders of prices paid for principles maintained despite personal cost. The young woman who prepared to begin her teaching career carried with her not just exceptional magical abilities and comprehensive theoretical knowledge, but hard-won understanding of the sacrifices that service sometimes demanded and the forms of happiness that duty might require one to abandon. Her brief experience of love had taught her lessons about the human heart that no academic study could have provided, while her professional success had demonstrated that exceptional ability created exceptional responsibility that couldn't be escaped through personal desire alone. The foundation had been laid for a career that would span decades and touch thousands of lives, but also for the personal isolation and emotional restraint that would characterize her approach to relationships throughout her adult life. The choice between love and duty had been made once with agonizing clarity, establishing patterns of thought and behavior that would influence every subsequent decision about personal happiness and professional obligation. The price of greatness was beginning to reveal itself, though its full cost would only become apparent through years of service that demanded everything she had to give while offering rewards that were meaningful but could never fully compensate for what had been lost. The letter of acceptance from Albus Dumbledore arrived with the warm glow of parchment that had been touched by phoenix feather, its elegant script carrying not just professional opportunity, but the promise of homecoming to a place where her talents would be valued for their truest purpose. The position offered was more than simple employment. It was invitation to join a community of educators whose dedication to nurturing young minds represented the highest form of magical service, work that could influence generations of witches and wizards who would carry forward the knowledge and values that defined civilized magical society. The journey back to Hogwarts was filled with emotions that transcended simple career transition, encompassing the complex mixture of anticipation and melancholy that marked all significant life passages. The Scottish countryside that rolled past her compartment window was unchanged from her student days, but she viewed it now with the perspective of someone who had experienced the wider world and chosen to return, not from inability to succeed elsewhere, but from recognition that her deepest calling lay within the ancient castle walls that had shaped her character and awakened her potential. The castle itself seemed to welcome her return with the kind of recognition that spoke to magical architecture's ability to sense and respond to the emotional states of those who moved through its spaces. The corridors that had once challenged her as a student now felt familiar and comfortable, while the classrooms where she had first discovered her exceptional abilities now awaited her presence as educator rather than pupil. The transformation from student to teacher was marked by subtle but significant changes in how the castle's magic interacted with her presence, acknowledging her new role and the responsibilities it entailed. Her appointment to the Transfiguration Department placed her directly under the guidance of Professor Dumbledore, whose own transition from departmental instructor to deputy headmaster had created opportunities for advancement that reflected both his growing administrative responsibilities and his confidence in her capabilities. Working closely with the wizard who had been her mentor during the achievement of Animaga's transformation now took on new dimensions as they collaborated as colleagues rather than simply teacher and exceptionally gifted student. The relationship that developed between them during these early years of her teaching career was built on mutual respect that transcended normal professional dynamics, encompassing shared commitment to educational excellence and recognition that they both possessed the kind of analytical brilliance that could address the complex challenges facing magical education in an increasingly complicated world. Their discussions about curriculum development and pedagogical theory were conducted at levels of sophistication that few other educators could have matched, while their collaboration on advanced magical research pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible within academic settings. But perhaps most significantly, their partnership was characterized by the kind of intellectual honesty that allowed both to acknowledge the limitations and challenges that even the most dedicated educators faced in preparing students for adult responsibilities that were becoming increasingly complex and dangerous. The world beyond Hogwarts was changing in ways that traditional magical education had not anticipated, requiring innovations and adaptations that could only be developed by people who understood both the theoretical foundations of magical learning and the practical demands that graduates would face in their professional lives. Minerva's approach to teaching was shaped by her recent experience in magical law enforcement, providing her with perspectives on the practical applications of transfiguration theory that purely academic preparation could never have delivered. Her students quickly learned that their new professor possessed not just exceptional theoretical knowledge, but real-world understanding of how magical skills were used outside the protected environment of school, making her instruction relevant and compelling in ways that impressed even those who had initially been skeptical about learning from someone barely older than themselves. The strictness that would become her trademark was established during these first years of teaching, born not from harshness or lack of compassion, but from absolute commitment to ensuring that her students achieved their maximum potential, regardless of the effort such achievement required. She had witnessed firsthand the consequences of inadequate magical education in her ministry work, understanding that students who left Hogwarts without proper preparation faced dangers that could prove fatal when theoretical knowledge proved insufficient for practical challenges. Her classroom became known throughout the castle as a place where excellence was not just encouraged but demanded, where students learned that magical education was serious business that required dedication matching the significance of the abilities they were developing. The transformations that her pupils achieved under her guidance were remarkable not just for their technical precision, but for the understanding that accompanied them, demonstrating that true mastery required comprehension of underlying principles rather than simple memorization of spell components and wand movements. But it was her inspirational qualities that distinguished her from other demanding professors. Her ability to convince students that the high standards she maintained were expressions of her confidence in their capabilities rather than arbitrary barriers to their success. The individual attention she provided to struggling students was legendary among those who benefited from it, while her recognition of exceptional achievement motivated even the most naturally gifted pupils to push beyond comfortable limitations into realms of accomplishment they had never imagined possible. The years that followed her return to Hogwarts were marked by the kind of professional fulfillment that justified every sacrifice she had made for her career, but they were also shadowed by the personal isolation that seemed to be the inevitable cost of the dedication that made her so effective as an educator. The locked box that she kept under her bed contained photographs and mementos from her brief engagement to Dougal McGregor, reminders of the happiness she had abandoned for duty that she couldn't bring herself to discard, despite the pain that their presence caused during moments of solitude and reflection. The news of Dougal's marriage reached her through her mother's letters, delivered with the kind of careful compassion that acknowledged the emotional significance of the information while attempting to minimize its immediate impact. Isabel's words were chosen with the precision of someone who understood exactly how deeply such news would wound, but also with the wisdom of someone who had made similar sacrifices and survived their consequences. The letter arrived during a particularly busy period of the school year, providing natural distractions that helped Minerva maintain her composure during the initial shock of learning that the man she had loved had indeed moved forward with his life as she had always known he eventually would. But the rational understanding that Dougal's marriage was both inevitable and appropriate could not completely shield her from the emotional devastation that accompanied final confirmation that their relationship belonged irretrievably to the past. The tears that came during solitary evening hours in her chambers were expressions of grief, not just for what had been lost, but for what could never be recovered, acknowledgement that some choices created consequences that persisted throughout entire lifetimes regardless of whether those choices had been correct by any reasonable measure. It was during one of these episodes of private mourning that Albus Dumbledore discovered her. His gentle knock on her office door arriving at precisely the moment when her carefully maintained composure finally cracked under the weight of accumulated sorrow. The sight of her tears seemed to affect him more deeply than professional circumstances would have warranted, suggesting that their relationship had evolved beyond simple collegiality into something approaching genuine friendship based on mutual understanding of the costs that dedication to their calling had exacted from both their personal lives. The conversation that followed was unlike any that had occurred between them during their previous interactions as teacher and student, or even as professional colleagues. The privacy of her darkened office and the vulnerability created by her obvious emotional distress combined to create conditions where normal social barriers dissolved, allowing both to speak with honesty about subjects that their usual reserve would never have permitted them to address directly. Dumbledore's willingness to share details about his own family history, the tragic death of his sister Ariana, and his lifelong guilt about the role he might have played in that catastrophe, was offered not as mere comfort, but as recognition that they both carried burdens that isolation only made heavier. His revelation that he too had sacrificed personal happiness for what he perceived as larger obligations created bonds of understanding that transcended their professional relationship, while providing context that helped explain the occasionally distant quality that characterized even their closest collaborations. But perhaps most significantly, their mutual confession of past mistakes and ongoing regrets established the foundation for a friendship that would sustain both through decades of increasing challenges and responsibilities. The recognition that they shared not just intellectual gifts, but also the particular form of loneliness that came from choosing duty over personal fulfillment, created emotional connections that would prove invaluable during the dark times that lay ahead, when their individual strengths would need to be combined to face threats that neither could have handled alone. The promotion to head of Gryffindor House that followed Professor Dippett's retirement was recognition of leadership qualities that had become obvious to anyone who observed Minerva's interactions with students and colleagues. Her natural authority was enhanced rather than diminished by the compassion she showed to those who struggled with their studies or personal challenges, while her absolute fairness in dealing with disciplinary issues earned her respect from students in all four houses rather than just those under her direct supervision. The responsibilities of her new position required skills that went beyond simple classroom instruction to encompass pastoral care, administrative coordination, and the kind of diplomatic navigation that house rivalries and student politics demanded. Her approach to these challenges reflected the same methodical thoroughness that characterized her teaching, but enhanced by understanding of human nature that had been deepened by her own experiences of loss and disappointment. Her relationship with students evolved to encompass not just academic guidance, but the kind of mentorship that helped young witches and wizards develop not only magical skills, but the character and judgment that would serve them throughout their adult lives. The conversations she conducted in her office during evening hours often dealt with problems that had little to do with transfiguration theory, but everything to do with the moral and emotional challenges that adolescents presented even to those blessed with magical abilities. But it was her ongoing friendship with Pomona Sprout that provided the most consistent source of personal satisfaction during these years of professional achievement and emotional isolation. Their relationship had evolved since their Hogwarts days into the kind of deep mutual support that sustained both through the challenges of their careers, while providing the comfort of understanding that came from shared history and values. Their regular meetings for tea and conversation became oases of normalcy in lives that were increasingly defined by institutional responsibilities and the careful maintenance of professional dignity that their positions required. With Pomona, Minerva could express doubts and concerns that she couldn't share with anyone else, while receiving the kind of practical wisdom and emotional support that helped her maintain perspective during particularly challenging periods. The years passed with the rhythm of academic terms and seasonal celebrations, marking time through the achievements and growth of students who arrived as children and departed as young adults prepared to take their places in the wider wizarding world. Minerva's reputation as an educator grew beyond the bounds of Hogwarts itself, as graduates spoke with reverence about the professor who had demanded their best while providing the support necessary to achieve excellence they had never believed possible. But the personal cost of such dedication was measured in relationships never formed, opportunities for happiness deliberately avoided, and the gradual acceptance that her life would be defined by service to others rather than pursuit of individual fulfillment. The choice she had made during that painful summer after graduation had established patterns of behavior that seemed to preclude the possibility of romantic attachment, creating emotional barriers that protected her from further heartbreak, while ensuring that professional achievement would remain her primary source of satisfaction. Elphinstone Urquhart's continued presence in her life provided both comfort and complication, his obvious devotion serving as constant reminder that she was valued not just as colleague, but as woman whose qualities extended beyond professional capabilities. His periodic visits to Hogwarts were occasions that she both anticipated and dreaded, bringing welcome connection to her former life in magical law enforcement, while also confronting her with choices about personal happiness that she had never fully resolved. His proposals, offered with consistent hope despite repeated disappointment, were expressions of love that touched her deeply, while highlighting the emotional walls she had constructed to protect herself from the kind of vulnerability that had once led to such devastating pain. The gentleness with which he accepted each rejection spoke to character that made her refusal even more difficult, while his patience in continuing to hope suggested understanding of her internal struggles that she hadn't realized was so obvious to others. The development of her reputation for strict but fair discipline was built on countless individual interactions with students who tested boundaries, challenged authority, or simply struggled to meet the high standards that she maintained in all aspects of her work. Her ability to distinguish between genuine misbehavior that required correction and simple adolescent testing of limits made her disciplinary decisions respected even by those who received punishment, while her willingness to provide additional support to students who were genuinely trying to improve earned her loyalty that extended far beyond their graduation years. The house point system became one of her most effective tools for maintaining both individual accountability and collective responsibility among her Gryffindor students, but her approach to its application reflected understanding that competition between houses should encourage excellence rather than create animosity. Her decisions about when to award or deduct points were made with careful consideration of their educational value rather than simple adherence to rules, demonstrating the kind of principled flexibility that effective leadership required. The Quidditch matches that marked the highlight of each academic year provided opportunities for Minerva to display aspects of her personality that classroom instruction rarely revealed. Her passionate support for Gryffindor team, combining competitive spirit with protective concern for student safety, that sometimes put her at odds with colleagues whose house loyalties were equally intense. Her knowledge of the game, gained during her own playing career, made her an effective advocate for her team, while ensuring that her expectations for behavior, both on and off the pitch, remained consistent with her overall educational philosophy. But it was during the quiet moments between terms, when the castle emptied of student voices and activity, that Minerva most acutely felt the isolation that her choices had created. The summers spent in preparation for coming academic years were filled with meaningful work that engaged her intellectual capabilities, but the evenings and weekends provided too much opportunity for reflection on paths not taken, and happiness deliberately abandoned for duty and principle. Her correspondence with family members in Scotland provided connection to the world beyond Hogwarts, while also serving as reminders of the relationships and experiences that her career had required her to sacrifice. The letters from her mother carried news of her younger brother's development and occasional updates about village life that inevitably included references to Dougal and his growing family. Information that Isabel shared with careful consideration for its emotional impact, but understanding that complete silence about his life would be even more painful than occasional brief updates. The photographs in her locked box remained unchanged while the years passed around them, preserving images of happiness that felt increasingly distant from the reality of her daily life. The young woman whose face smiled back at her from those faded images seemed almost like a stranger, someone whose capacity for simple joy had been gradually eroded by the weight of responsibilities and the accumulated disappointments that defined adult life, even when that life was objectively successful by every measurable standard. Yet the work itself provided satisfactions that sustained her through periods of personal loneliness and regret, as she witnessed the transformation of uncertain first-year students into confident young adults whose magical abilities had been developed to their full potential under her guidance. The knowledge that her dedication had contributed to their success, that her high standards had pushed them to achievements they couldn't have imagined when they first entered her classroom, provided meaning that compensated for much of what she had sacrificed for her career. The gradual evolution of her working relationship with Dumbledore into something approaching family created bonds that helped fill some of the emotional void that her personal choices had created. Their shared dedication to educational excellence and mutual recognition of the sacrifices that such dedication required provided foundation for understanding that transcended normal professional relationships while remaining carefully bounded by the respect and propriety that their positions demanded. Their collaboration on advanced magical research projects and curriculum development provided intellectual stimulation that challenged even her exceptional capabilities, while their discussions about the challenges facing magical education revealed shared concerns about the increasing complexity of the world that their students would inherit. The wisdom that Dumbledore had gained through decades of experience, combined with her fresh perspectives and recent practical experience to create partnership that benefited both their individual effectiveness and the institution they served. The recognition that came through various professional honors and awards provided external validation of achievements that she took pride in, while understanding that such recognition was secondary to the real measure of her success, the quality of education she provided to students who trusted her with their development during some of the most crucial years of their lives. The certificates and commendations that accumulated in her office were meaningful, primarily as indicators that others recognized the value of work that she would have pursued with equal dedication, regardless of whether it received public acknowledgement. But perhaps the most significant development during these years was her gradual acceptance that the life she had built, while different from what she had once imagined possible, was valuable and meaningful in ways that conventional measures of personal happiness couldn't adequately capture. The students whose lives she had influenced, the colleagues whose work she had supported, and the institution whose mission she had advanced through her service represented achievements that would outlive her individual existence while contributing to the improvement of magical society in ways that purely personal fulfillment could never have matched. The woman who had once torn herself away from love and domestic happiness had become someone whose influence extended far beyond what any individual relationship could have provided, touching hundreds of young lives while contributing to the preservation and advancement of knowledge that would benefit generations of witches and wizards yet to be born. The sacrifice had been real and permanent, but so were the achievements that had been purchased through that sacrifice, creating a legacy that gave deeper meaning to choices that had seemed purely destructive when they were first made. Yet the locked box under her bed remained, its contents serving as reminder that even the most successful and meaningful life carried costs that could never be fully reconciled or forgotten. The happiness she had abandoned continued to exist in memory and imagination, providing both comfort during difficult moments and pain during times when professional achievement felt insufficient compensation for personal isolation. The balance between satisfaction and regret would remain delicate throughout her life, requiring constant attention to maintain equilibrium between recognition of what had been accomplished and acknowledgement of what had been lost in the service of those accomplishments. The foundation had been established for decades of distinguished service that would make her name legendary within magical education, but also for the personal compromises and emotional restraint that would characterize her approach to all future relationships. The choice between love and duty had been made with full understanding of its consequences, establishing patterns of thought and behavior that would influence every subsequent decision about the balance between individual happiness and service to others who needed her unique combination of talents and dedication. The shadows of war began gathering over magical Britain during the autumn of 1970, though their darkness was visible only to those who possessed the wisdom to recognize the patterns that preceded widespread violence and social collapse. For most witches and wizards, life continued with comfortable normalcy that made the growing threat seem distant and theoretical. But Minerva McGonagall had learned during her brief career in magical law enforcement to read the subtle signs that indicated when criminal activity was evolving from isolated incidents into coordinated campaigns of terror that would eventually consume everything in their path. The reports that filtered through official channels spoke of mysterious disappearances, unexplained magical disturbances, and incidents of violence that bore signatures of organization and planning rather than random criminal activity. The victims were chosen according to patterns that suggested ideological motivation rather than simple greed or personal vendetta, while the methods employed demonstrated magical sophistication that exceeded what individual criminals normally possessed. Most troubling of all was the complete absence of witnesses or physical evidence that might allow ministry investigators to identify those responsible or predict where the next attacks might occur. But it was the quality of silence that surrounded these incidents that most concerned those who understood how information flowed through magical society. In normal circumstances, criminal activity generated rumors, speculation, and the kind of nervous chatter that reflected community anxiety about threats to public safety. The strange incidents of the early 1970s were met instead with the kind of fearful quiet that indicated people knew more than they were willing to discuss openly, suggesting that intimidation and terror were being used as weapons to suppress normal social communication. Minerva's position at Hogwarts provided her with unique perspective on these developments, as students from families throughout magical Britain brought with them fragments of information and overheard conversations that revealed far more about the true scope of the threat than official sources were willing to acknowledge. The careful questions she asked during individual conferences and the patterns she detected in student behavior created a picture of growing fear that extended far beyond what ministry statements suggested was occurring. The name Voldemort first reached her attention through whispered conversations between older students whose families moved in pure-blood social circles where such information circulated despite official attempts at suppression. The reactions that this name provoked, fear so profound that it prevented even private discussion, suggested that whatever force had chosen this identity possessed power that exceeded normal criminal capabilities and ambitions that extended far beyond conventional criminal goals. Her correspondence with former colleagues in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement provided additional confirmation that the threats were both real and far more serious than public statements indicated. Elphinstone Urquhart's carefully worded letters spoke of investigations that led nowhere, witnesses who disappeared before they could provide testimony, and evidence that vanished from supposedly secure locations, as if the criminals possessed inside knowledge of ministry procedures and capabilities. But perhaps most troubling was the gradual change in atmosphere at Hogwarts itself. As parents began expressing concerns about their children's safety, and some families considered whether magical education was worth the risks that leaving home might entail, the ancient castle that had been sanctuary for centuries of students was beginning to feel vulnerable in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about the security that its walls and protective enchantments provided against external threats. Dumbledore's response to these developments was characteristically complex, combining public reassurance with private preparation that demonstrated his understanding that the challenges ahead would require responses that went far beyond conventional institutional security measures. His discussions with Minerva about enhanced protective measures for the school revealed knowledge about the growing threat that suggested sources of information that extended far beyond what official channels provided to most ministry officials. The formation of what would eventually become known as the Order of the Phoenix began during these early years as an informal network of individuals who shared concern about the developing crisis and willingness to take actions that official channels seemed unable or unwilling to pursue. The recruitment was conducted with careful discretion that reflected understanding of the risks that such involvement might entail, while the organizational structure was kept deliberately informal to avoid creating the kind of formal opposition that might provoke premature confrontation with forces whose full capabilities remained unknown. Minerva's decision not to join the Order during its initial formation was made not from lack of commitment to opposing the growing darkness, but from recognition that her responsibilities at Hogwarts were too important to compromise. Through involvement in activities that might require her attention and loyalty to be divided between competing obligations, the students who depended on her for education and guidance deserved her complete dedication, while the institution itself needed her skills and knowledge to maintain the standards of excellence that magical education required, even during times of crisis. But her refusal to join the Order formally did not prevent her from providing support that proved invaluable to the organization's early operations. Her position at Hogwarts gave her access to information about student families and social networks that helped Order members understand the scope of infiltration and recruitment that Voldemort's forces were achieving within pure-blood society, while her knowledge of ministry procedures and personnel from her law enforcement career provided insights that enhanced their operational planning and security measures. The intelligence gathering that she conducted during these years was accomplished through her animagus abilities, transforming into her tabby cat form to observe locations and conversations that would have been impossible to monitor through conventional means. Her small size and obviously feline behavior allowed her to remain undetected in situations where human observers would have been immediately noticed and potentially eliminated, while her retained human intelligence enabled her to understand and remember details that normal animal surveillance could never have provided. The nights spent in such covert observation were among the most dangerous of her life, requiring her to venture into areas where Death Eater activity was suspected, while maintaining perfect concealment that could mean the difference between successful intelligence gathering and capture that would have resulted in torture, death. The information she obtained through these missions was passed to Order members through carefully arranged meetings that protected both her identity and theirs, while ensuring that crucial intelligence reached those who could act upon it most effectively. But the personal cost of such activities was measured not just in physical danger, but in the psychological toll of regularly witnessing the worst aspects of human nature, while being unable to intervene directly to protect the innocent, victims who suffered at the hands of Voldemort's followers. The scenes of torture and murder that she observed during these surveillance missions created memories that would haunt her dreams for decades, while the knowledge of atrocities that she couldn't prevent without compromising her cover generated guilt that was almost unbearable, despite the rational understanding that her intelligence work served the larger cause more effectively than individual rescue attempts could have achieved. The death of her younger brother Robert during a Death Eater attack in 1978 was the first personal loss that brought the war directly into her own life, transforming abstract concern about growing violence into immediate grief and rage that tested every principle she held about measured response and careful planning. The news reached her through ministry channels that were deliberately clinical in their reporting, reducing her brother's murder to statistical data that failed completely to capture the reality of what his loss meant to those who had loved him. Robert had been working as a junior Auror in the Scottish office when he encountered a Death Eater cell that was recruiting werewolves for Voldemort's forces. His investigation, bringing him into contact with enemies whose ruthlessness exceeded anything his training had prepared him to handle. The magical signature left at the scene of his death indicated that he had fought bravely but been overwhelmed by superior numbers and more advanced dark arts knowledge, dying in service to the same ideals that had motivated his sister's dedication to education and justice. The funeral that brought the McGonagall family together for the first time in years was conducted under heavy security that reflected the reality that association with Robert's work made them all potential targets for retaliation from enemies who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill anyone who opposed their activities. The grief that united them was complicated by fear about what his death might mean for their own safety, while the pride they felt in his courage was shadowed by recognition that such courage had proved insufficient protection against the forces that were consuming magical society. Minerva's reaction to her brother's death was initially one of devastating sorrow that threatened to overwhelm the emotional control she had maintained throughout her adult life. But this grief gradually transformed into cold determination that enhanced rather than compromised her effectiveness in opposing the forces that had taken him from them. The personal investment that she now had in the war's outcome gave new intensity to her intelligence work, while providing motivation that sustained her through dangers that might otherwise have seemed too great to justify. But it was the news of Dougal McGregor's death that delivered the most devastating blow to her emotional equilibrium, bringing word that the man she had loved and abandoned had been killed, along with his entire family, in one of the random anti-Muggle attacks that Death Eaters used to spread terror throughout the non-magical community. The information reached her through her mother's carefully worded letter, which attempted to provide necessary details while minimizing the immediate emotional impact of learning that the happiness she had sacrificed was now lost forever in the most brutal way imaginable. Dougal's murder was particularly cruel because it represented the complete futility of her sacrifice during that painful summer after her Hogwarts graduation. She had abandoned their engagement to protect him from the dangers that association with magical society might bring, only to discover that such protection was ultimately meaningless when Voldemort's forces were willing to kill Muggles simply because their existence challenged pure-blood supremacist ideology. Her noble gesture of letting him go had failed completely to achieve its intended purpose, leaving her with neither the happiness that love might have provided, nor the satisfaction of knowing that her sacrifice had accomplished its goal. The grief that followed this revelation was different from anything she had previously experienced, encompassing not just sorrow over his death, but profound regret about the years of potential happiness that had been lost to fears that had proven inadequate to prevent the very tragedy they were meant to avoid. The conversations they might have had, the life they could have built together, the children who might have carried forward the best qualities of both parents, all had been sacrificed for nothing, destroyed by forces that recognized no distinction between magical and non-magical innocence. Yet it was precisely this devastating loss that finally freed her from the emotional paralysis that had prevented her from accepting Elphinstone Urquhart's repeated proposals during the years of her self-imposed isolation. The recognition that life was fragile and happiness was rare made continued refusal seem like additional waste of possibilities that might never be offered again. While her grief over Dougal's death had paradoxically completed the mourning process that allowed her to consider the possibility of loving someone else, without feeling that such love represented betrayal of memory. When Elphinstone proposed again during the early 1980s, his offer came at a moment when Minerva was finally ready to hear it, not as threat to carefully maintained emotional barriers, but as opportunity for the kind of companionship and mutual support that could provide meaning and comfort during increasingly dark times. His patient devotion over so many years had demonstrated the kind of steady character that she had learned to value more highly than the passionate intensity that had characterized her relationship with Dougal, while his understanding of her work and dedication meant that marriage to him wouldn't require the sacrifices that had made her previous engagement impossible. Their wedding was a quiet affair that reflected both their mature ages and their shared understanding that this union was built on practical compatibility and genuine affection rather than the overwhelming passion that characterized younger relationships. The ceremony was attended by close friends and family members who understood that this marriage represented not just personal happiness, but strategic alliance between two people whose combined talents and resources could contribute more effectively to the challenges they both faced in their professional lives. The decision to retain her family name was made not from disrespect for Elphinstone, but from recognition that McGonagall had become associated with her professional achievements in ways that changing it would have created unnecessary confusion and administrative complications. Her husband's understanding of this practical consideration and his willingness to accept a wife who valued her career identity sufficiently to maintain it despite social conventions demonstrated the kind of enlightened thinking that made their marriage sustainable in ways that more traditional arrangements might not have achieved. The cottage in Hogsmeade that became their marital home was chosen for its convenient location rather than romantic appeal, but it quickly developed the kind of warmth and character that reflected the genuine happiness of its occupants. Elphinstone's retirement from active ministry service allowed him to dedicate his considerable talents to creating a domestic environment that supported Minerva's demanding career, while providing the kind of peaceful retreat that her work at Hogwarts made essential for maintaining her emotional and physical health. Their marriage was characterized by the kind of comfortable partnership that mature individuals could build when they understood each other's strengths and limitations while sharing fundamental values about the importance of service and dedication to work that benefited others. The intellectual conversations that filled their evenings together provided both with perspectives that enhanced their individual effectiveness while the emotional support they offered each other created stability that allowed both to face professional challenges with greater confidence and resilience. The absence of children from their marriage was a deliberate choice that reflected their ages and the reality that their combined professional commitments left little time or energy for the demands that parenthood would have imposed. Instead, they found fulfillment in their relationships with Minerva's nieces and nephews, who became frequent visitors, whose presence filled their home with the kind of youthful energy that reminded them of the purposes that motivated their adult responsibilities. But it was the quality of their daily interactions that provided the deepest satisfaction, as they developed the kind of easy intimacy that allowed them to share thoughts and concerns without the careful diplomacy that their professional relationships required. Elphinstone's appreciation for Minerva's intelligence and dedication was matched by her gratitude for his patience and understanding, creating mutual respect that served as foundation for affection that deepened gradually over the years of their marriage. The happiness that characterized this period of her life was enhanced by her growing recognition that the choice to marry Elphinstone had been not just personally satisfying but strategically wise, as his knowledge of ministry procedures and personnel provided valuable support for her continued intelligence work, while his emotional stability helped her maintain perspective during the most challenging aspects of the war against Voldemort's forces. The mission that brought her into direct contact with Harry Potter as an infant was both honor and burden, representing Dumbledore's trust in her judgment while confronting her with responsibility for decisions that would affect the future of magical society in ways that couldn't be fully anticipated. The assignment to evaluate the Dursley household as potential guardians for the famous baby required her to spend days in her animagus form, observing family dynamics that would determine whether Harry would receive the love and support that his traumatic early life had made essential for his psychological development. What she discovered during her surveillance was deeply troubling, revealing a family whose attitudes toward anything unusual or exceptional made them fundamentally unsuitable as guardians for a child whose very existence challenged their narrow worldview. Vernon Dursley's obvious prejudice against anything that deviated from his conception of normality, combined with Petunia's bitter resentment toward the magical world that had claimed her sister, created an environment that would be actively hostile to a child whose magical heritage made him inherently different from the conventional existence they valued above all other considerations. Her report to Dumbledore expressed these concerns in terms that made clear her belief that alternative arrangements should be sought, but his response revealed that Harry's protection required not just loving guardians, but specific magical protections that could only be maintained through his residence with blood relatives who shared his mother's sacrifice. The complex magic that Lily Potter's death had invoked would continue to protect her son only as long as he could call his aunt's house home, making the Dursley placement essential despite its obvious emotional limitations. The compromise that emerged from their discussions involved Minerva's agreement to monitor Harry's welfare from a distance, using her animagus abilities to conduct periodic surveillance that would ensure his basic safety while avoiding detection that might compromise the protective magic that his residence with the Dursleys maintained. These visits became among the most personally painful aspects of her intelligence work, as she was forced to witness his neglect and emotional abuse while being unable to intervene without potentially destroying the protections that kept him alive. But it was the gradual recognition of Harry's resilience and fundamental decency, despite the treatment he received from his guardians, that provided hope that Lily's sacrifice would prove worthwhile in ways that extended beyond simple physical protection. The child who might have been broken by such systematic emotional deprivation instead demonstrated strength of character that suggested he would be capable of fulfilling the extraordinary destiny that his survival had created. Though the costs of his preparation would be measured in loneliness and self-doubt, that more nurturing childhood could have prevented. The happiness of Minerva's marriage to Elphinstone reached its peak during the mid-1980s, when his retirement allowed them to spend more time together, while her responsibilities at Hogwarts provided structure and purpose that gave meaning to their domestic life. Their cottage became a gathering place for friends and colleagues whose own work in opposing dark forces created natural bonds of understanding and mutual support, while their combined resources allowed them to contribute materially to causes that aligned with their shared values. But this period of contentment was shattered when Elphinstone's encounter with a venomous tentacula, during what should have been a routine botanical expedition, resulted in poisoning that proved resistant to all known medical treatments. The creature's venom contained magical toxins that attacked not just his physical systems but the magical pathways that sustained life itself, creating deterioration that even Mungo's most experienced healers could slow but not reverse. The weeks that followed his injury were filled with the kind of desperate hope that accompanies medical crises, where love and determination seem insufficient to influence outcomes that depend on factors beyond human control. Minerva spent every moment she could spare from her teaching duties at his bedside, using her considerable knowledge of transfiguration theory to assist healers in developing treatments that might counteract the venom's effects, while maintaining the emotional support that she hoped might provide him with strength to fight the poison that was slowly destroying his body. But the venom's progress proved inexorable, despite every effort to halt or reverse its effects, gradually claiming function after function, until it became clear that the man she had finally learned to love was going to be taken from her, just as she had discovered what genuine marital happiness could provide. The cruelty of losing him, after such a brief period of contentment, seemed almost calculated to inflict maximum emotional damage, destroying the possibility of happiness, just as she had begun to believe that her sacrifices might be rewarded with some measure of personal fulfillment. His death, when it finally came, was peaceful in the way that such things can be when acceptance has replaced struggle, but the grief that followed was devastating, in ways that surprised even those who understood the depth of their bond. The woman who had survived her brother's murder and Dougal's death with dignity intact found herself completely undone by the loss of the companionship that had provided stability during the darkest period of recent magical history, leaving her more isolated than she had ever been despite the sympathy and support that surrounded her. The cottage that had been their sanctuary became impossible for her to inhabit alone, its every room filled with memories that were too precious to abandon, but too painful to endure on a daily basis. The decision to return to her chambers at Hogwarts was made not from inability to live independently, but from understanding that solitude in a place where she had been happy would prevent the healing that required her to focus on purposes larger than her personal grief. The return to full-time residence at the castle marked the end of her experiment with conventional domestic happiness and the beginning of a period when her work became not just career but complete identity, filling the emotional void that personal loss had created, while providing focus that prevented complete surrender to grief that might otherwise have proved overwhelming. The students who depended on her deserved better than a teacher who was paralyzed by personal sorrow, while the institution itself needed her knowledge and dedication to maintain standards that were essential for preparing young witches and wizards for the challenges they would face in an increasingly dangerous world. But the cost of this emotional compartmentalization was measured in the gradual hardening of personal relationships and the development of protective barriers that would prevent future attachments from creating similar vulnerability. The woman who emerged from her period of mourning was more formidable as educator and colleague, but less accessible as friend or potential partner, having learned through painful experience that love created obligations and vulnerabilities that might ultimately prove inconsistent with the larger responsibilities that defined her truest identity, the recognition that she had experienced and lost the only conventional happiness that her life was likely to provide, brought with it a kind of liberation that allowed her to dedicate herself completely to work that had always been her deepest calling. The possibility of personal fulfillment through marriage and domestic life had been tested and found both precious and fragile, leaving her free to pursue excellence in areas where her control was more complete and her efforts more likely to produce lasting results. Yet the grief that had driven her back to solitude also deepened her understanding of the students who sought her guidance, as she now possessed first-hand knowledge of the forms of loss and disappointment that young people faced when their dreams encountered the harsh realities of adult life. The compassion that had always characterized her teaching was enhanced by recognition that academic achievement, however important, was insufficient preparation for the emotional challenges that would test her students long after they had mastered the most complex transfiguration spells. The foundation had been established for the final phase of her career, when personal considerations would be completely subordinated to institutional service and the larger struggle against forces that threatened everything she valued about magical civilization. The capacity for happiness had been demonstrated and then lost, leaving her with memories that provided both comfort and pain, while confirming that her deepest fulfillment would come through service to others, rather than pursuit of individual satisfaction. The return to her chambers at Hogwarts marked not just a change of residence, but a fundamental transformation in how Minerva approached both her professional responsibilities and personal identity, throwing herself into educational work with intensity that bordered on obsession, while using the demands of teaching and administration as barriers against the grief that threatened to overwhelm her during quiet moments when memories of lost happiness could surface unbidden. The castle that had always been her true home welcomed her back with the kind of recognition that ancient magical architecture could provide to those whose dedication had earned them permanent place within its protective embrace. The rooms that had once felt cramped compared to the cottage she had shared with Elphinstone now seemed perfectly suited to someone whose life would be defined entirely by service to others rather than pursuit of personal fulfillment. The sparse furnishings and utilitarian arrangement reflected priorities that placed institutional needs above individual comfort, while the proximity to student dormitories ensured that her availability for guidance and support would never be compromised by the inconvenience of distance or the temptation to maintain boundaries between professional and personal time. But it was the development of the protective measures that would safeguard the Philosopher's Stone that provided the most immediate focus for energies that might otherwise have been consumed by mourning and regret. Dumbledore's request that she contribute to the complex series of magical barriers designed to prevent unauthorized access to the legendary artifact represented recognition of her exceptional abilities, while offering the kind of intellectual challenge that could occupy her mind completely during the vulnerable period when grief made normal activities feel meaningless. The giant chessboard that became her contribution to the stone's protection was a masterpiece of transfiguration theory applied to practical defense, creating animated pieces whose intelligence and tactical sophistication exceeded anything that conventional magical chess had ever achieved. Each piece possessed not just the ability to move and capture according to chess rules, but genuine strategic understanding that allowed them to adapt their play to the specific capabilities and weaknesses of opponents who faced them, ensuring that passage would require not just knowledge of the game, but exceptional skill and courage. The months spent perfecting the magical mechanisms that controlled the chess pieces provided therapeutic distraction from personal loss, while allowing her to channel grief into creative work that would protect something of enormous importance to the magical world. The complexity of the spells required total concentration, that left no mental space for dwelling on might-have-beens or what-ifs, while the technical challenges involved pushed her magical abilities to their absolute limits in ways that provided the kind of satisfaction that came from achieving mastery over problems that would have defeated lesser talents. But perhaps most significantly, the work represented collaboration with Dumbledore during one of the most difficult periods of her life, his subtle support and understanding, helping her maintain functionality while never intruding on the grieving process that she needed to complete in her own time and manner. Their discussions about the stone's protection revealed shared recognition that the artifact's power made it an inevitable target for forces that would stop at nothing to claim it, requiring defenses that assumed the highest levels of enemy capability and determination. The arrival of Harry Potter at Hogwarts in September of 1991 represented a moment that Minerva had been anticipating and dreading in equal measure for over a decade, bringing face to face with the child whose welfare she had monitored from distance while being unable to provide the nurturing and protection that his circumstances had made so desperately necessary. The 11-year-old boy who walked into the Great Hall for his sorting bore visible marks of the neglect and emotional deprivation that his guardians had inflicted, yet also displayed resilience and fundamental decency that testified to the strength of character he had somehow maintained, despite treatment that might have destroyed a weaker child. The sorting hat's deliberation over his placement was mercifully brief compared to her own legendary 5.5-minute wait, but the decision to place him in Gryffindor brought mixture of pride and apprehension that reflected her understanding of what such assignment would mean for both his development and her own responsibilities as head of house. Harry Potter would not be an ordinary student whose needs could be met through conventional teaching methods, but young wizard whose very presence at Hogwarts would attract attention and danger that could threaten not just himself but everyone around him. Her decision to recruit him for the Gryffindor Quidditch team, despite his first-year status, was made not from favoritism, but from recognition that his flying abilities represented natural talent, so exceptional that denying him proper training and competition would have been educational malpractice of the highest order. The rules that prohibited first-year students from team membership were well-intentioned but inflexible, failing to account for circumstances where such restrictions might prevent, rather than promote, student development and success. The acquisition of the Nimbus 2000 broomstick that she arranged for Harry was accomplished through methods that bent institutional policies while remaining technically within the boundaries of what head of house authority allowed, demonstrating the kind of creative rule interpretation that effective educators sometimes needed to employ when student welfare conflicted with administrative convenience. The expense involved was considerable, but her personal resources had been enhanced by Elphinstone's estate in ways that made such expenditure possible without creating financial hardship. Yet her support for Harry's Quidditch participation was balanced by absolute refusal to compromise the academic and behavioral standards that applied to all students regardless of their fame or special circumstances. The detention she assigned him for being out of bed after hours was conducted with the same seriousness that any other student's violation would have received, while her decision to deduct house points for his involvement in unauthorized nighttime adventures demonstrated that celebrity status provided no exemption from the rules that maintained order and safety within the castle. The 150 points she removed from Gryffindor House following the dragon incident was perhaps the most painful disciplinary decision of her entire career, requiring her to penalize her own house and students she cared deeply about in order to maintain principles that were more important than short-term popularity or competitive advantage. The decision ensured that Gryffindor would finish last in the House Cup competition for the first time in years, but it also sent clear message about the consequences of reckless behavior, that endangered both participants and innocent bystanders. But it was the unexpected reversal that occurred at the year-end feast, when Dumbledore's last-minute point awards recognized the courage and moral character that Harry and his friends had displayed in protecting the Philosopher's Stone, that provided validation of her educational philosophy and restoration of house pride that made the earlier punishment worthwhile. The joy that filled the Great Hall when Gryffindor's victory was announced was matched by her own satisfaction at seeing her students' bravery properly rewarded, demonstrating that principles and pragmatism could coexist when both were guided by wisdom and applied with appropriate timing. The crisis that began Harry's second year at Hogwarts tested both her administrative capabilities and her emotional resilience in ways that the Philosopher's Stone incident had not approached, as the Chamber of Secrets attacks created atmosphere of fear and suspicion that threatened to destroy the educational environment that she had dedicated her career to maintaining. The systematic petrification of students represented not just physical threat, but psychological warfare, designed to undermine confidence in the school's ability to protect those entrusted to its care. Her appointment as temporary headmistress following Dumbledore's forced departure was recognition of her administrative capabilities and the respect she commanded throughout the school community, but it also placed her in the impossible position of maintaining institutional function while confronting threats that exceeded her individual ability to resolve. The responsibility for every student's safety, combined with the knowledge that the attacks would likely continue until their source was identified and eliminated, created pressure that tested every leadership skill she had developed during her years as head of Gryffindor House. The decision to close the school that she was forced to contemplate when Ginny Weasley's abduction made it clear that the threat had escalated beyond what reasonable precautions could address was perhaps the most difficult of her entire career, representing acknowledgement that even Hogwarts could not provide absolute safety when confronted by enemies who possessed knowledge and capabilities that exceeded the castle's ancient defenses. The announcement that she was reluctantly prepared to make would have ended centuries of continuous education, while admitting that forces of darkness had achieved victory that might permanently damage magical Britain's educational foundation. But Harry and Ron's successful rescue mission and their destruction of the basilisk that had been terrorizing the school provided resolution that vindicated her faith in student courage, while demonstrating the kind of heroism that justified every risk that magical education entailed. Their willingness to venture into mortal danger to save their friend exemplified the values that Gryffindor House was meant to instill, while their success proved that proper education could prepare even young students to face challenges that adult wizards might find overwhelming. The restoration of normal school operations following the crisis allowed her to return to teaching responsibilities with renewed appreciation for the ordinary rhythms of academic life. Though the experience of nearly losing the institution she loved had strengthened her resolve to ensure that future threats would find Hogwarts better prepared to protect its students without compromising the educational mission that made such protection meaningful. Her decision to provide Hermione Granger with a time-turner during the girl's third year represented the kind of educational risk-taking that distinguished exceptional teachers from merely competent ones, recognizing that some students possessed both the intellectual capability and moral character necessary to handle responsibilities that would overwhelm their peers. The device that allowed Hermione to attend multiple classes simultaneously was unprecedented resource for student use, requiring special ministry permission and personal guarantees about its security and proper application. The trust that such arrangement required was enormous on both sides. As Minerva placed her professional reputation and career security in the hands of a 13-year-old student whose maturity and judgment would determine whether the experiment succeeded or created disasters that could affect far more than individual academic achievement. The promise she extracted from Hermione about the Time Turner's use was comprehensive and serious, covering not just the obvious dangers of temporal manipulation, but the subtle risks that came from possessing capabilities that classmates couldn't understand or share. But her faith in Hermione's character proved justified throughout the year, as the girl demonstrated not just the intellectual brilliance necessary to manage such complex scheduling, but the emotional stability required to handle the isolation and pressure that came from living partially outside normal time. The academic achievements that the Time Turner made possible were remarkable, even by Hermione's exceptional standards, while her discretion about its use protected both herself and others from the complications that revelation might have created. The painful decision to refuse Harry's request that she sign his Hogsmeade permission form was made not from lack of compassion, but from recognition that her responsibilities as educator sometimes required her to disappoint students in order to protect them from dangers that their youth made them unable to fully appreciate. The legal restrictions that prevented her from acting as parental substitute were clear and inflexible, but beyond mere procedural requirements lay genuine concern about Harry's safety in situations where his fame made him obvious target for enemies who might view public appearances as opportunities for attack or kidnapping. Her explanation to Harry about why such permission was impossible was delivered with the kind of firmness that brooked no argument while attempting to convey understanding of his disappointment and isolation. The phrase, "neither your mother nor your father," was chosen specifically to remind him of the losses that made his situation unique, while avoiding sentimentality that might encourage him to view the restriction as arbitrary rather than necessary protection. But the destruction of his Nimbus 2000 by the Whomping Willow created situation that required her to balance institutional neutrality with personal concern for student who had lost not just valuable equipment, but connection to activity that provided him with joy and sense of belonging that his difficult home life had never allowed. The broomstick had been more than mere sporting equipment, but symbol of his acceptance into magical world and recognition of talents that distinguished him as individual rather than simply famous survivor. The arrival of the firebolt that replaced his destroyed broom created security challenge that required her to balance Harry's obvious excitement about receiving such magnificent gift with realistic assessment of dangers that anonymous presence might represent. The broomstick's value exceeded anything that normal well-wishers could afford, suggesting either extraordinary generosity or more sinister purposes that might involve cursing or tracking the recipient through magical objects whose provenance couldn't be verified. Her decision to confiscate the firebolt for examination was based on intelligence that Sirius Black had escaped from Azkaban and might be attempting to reach Harry through methods that normal security measures couldn't detect. The possibility that the broom might be booby-trapped or designed to malfunction at crucial moments made its use potentially fatal, requiring thorough investigation. Despite the disappointment that such precautions would cause to student who had already suffered more losses than any child should be forced to endure, the examination that she conducted along with Professors Flitwick and Sprout was exhaustive and professional, employing detection methods that could identify any known form of magical sabotage or surveillance enchantment. Their conclusion that the firebolt was genuine and safe was delivered with confidence that reflected their combined expertise, while the return of the broomstick to Harry was accompanied by apologies for the delay and explanations about the security concerns that had made such precautions necessary. But it was Harry's subsequent performance on the firebolt that provided the most satisfying vindication of her earlier support for his Quidditch participation, as he led Gryffindor to their first Quidditch Cup victory in many years, while demonstrating flying skills that exceeded even the exceptional promise he had shown during his first year at Hogwarts. The triumph was particularly sweet because it came at Slytherin's expense, fulfilling the lifelong ambition that had been born during her own playing career, when similar rivals had ended her competitive participation through deliberate foul play. The sight of the Quidditch Cup returning to Gryffindor Tower, after years of Slytherin dominance, was an emotional experience that exceeded what normal sporting victory could have provided, representing not just athletic achievement, but validation of the values that her house was meant to embody. Her tears during the celebration were expressions of joy that encompassed far more than single match result, reflecting pride in students who had demonstrated the courage and determination that made their success meaningful rather than merely fortunate. The Triwizard Tournament that marked Harry's 4th year at Hogwarts created challenges that tested every aspect of her protective instincts and educational philosophy, as the competition's revival brought dangers that exceeded what any student should be expected to face, regardless of their magical abilities or previous experiences with life-threatening situations. The entry of Harry's name by the Goblet of Fire, despite his underage status and lack of voluntary participation, created legal and ethical dilemmas that had no satisfactory resolution within existing magical law. Her confrontation with Dumbledore about Harry's forced participation in the tournament was conducted with passion that reflected not just professional concern, but personal investment in the welfare of student who had already faced more danger and trauma than most adult wizards experienced in their entire careers. The phrase, "He's a boy, not a piece of meat," was chosen specifically to remind everyone present that Harry remained child deserving protection rather than weapon to be deployed against threats that others were unwilling or unable to address directly. But the magical contract that bound tournament participants was absolute and unbreakable, making her objections academic regardless of their moral validity or practical wisdom. The recognition that Harry would be forced to compete in tasks designed to challenge adult wizards with years of additional training and experience created anxiety that would persist throughout the tournament year, as she struggled to provide support and guidance while respecting the competition's requirement that champions receive no outside assistance. The death of Cedric Diggory and Harry's traumatic encounter with the resurrected Voldemort during the tournament's final task marked the end of the peaceful interlude that had characterized the early 1990s and the beginning of a new phase of conflict that would ultimately claim many more lives before resolution was achieved. The boy who returned from the graveyard was fundamentally changed by experiences that had stripped away remaining vestiges of childhood innocence, while providing him with knowledge about evil and suffering that no 14-year-old should possess. Her response to the crisis that followed Voldemort's return was immediate and unqualified, accepting Dumbledore's invitation to join the Reformed Order of the Phoenix with enthusiasm that reflected not just intellectual conviction about the threat they faced, but personal commitment born from years of protecting students who would be primary targets for Death Eater recruitment and intimidation. The safety of Hogwarts and its inhabitants had become inseparable from the larger struggle against forces that sought to destroy everything she valued about magical civilization. The summer that followed the tournament's tragic conclusion was spent in preparation for school year that would require new levels of vigilance and protection while maintaining educational standards that prepared students for challenges they would face in a world where neutrality was no longer possible. The war that had seemed to end during Harry's infancy had resumed with renewed intensity, requiring responses that drew upon every lesson learned during the previous conflict, while acknowledging that enemies had adapted and evolved in ways that made old strategies insufficient for new realities. The woman who prepared to face these challenges carried with her not just exceptional magical abilities and decades of educational experience, but hard-won understanding of the personal costs that service sometimes demanded and the forms of happiness that duty might require one to abandon. The losses she had endured had not diminished her commitment, but had refined it, creating determination that was enhanced rather than weakened by recognition of what victory would require from those brave enough to fight for it. The appointment of Dolores Umbridge as Defense Against the Dark Arts Professor marked the beginning of the most challenging period in Minerva's educational career, representing not just disagreement over teaching methods, but fundamental assault on the principles of academic freedom and intellectual honesty that had defined Hogwarts for over 1,000 years. The woman who arrived at the castle with ministry credentials and sickly sweet demeanor possessed the kind of bureaucratic authority that could override institutional tradition while pursuing an agenda that prioritized political control over educational excellence. Umbridge's initial staff meeting revealed the scope of her ambitions and the methods she intended to employ in transforming Hogwarts from center of learning into instrument of government propaganda, her saccharine tone and pink decorations concealing authoritarian impulses that would have been more honestly expressed through direct intimidation and open threats. The educational decrees that she introduced with increasing frequency were designed not to improve teaching but to eliminate any instruction that might encourage students to think independently about the political realities that were shaping their world. The conflict between Minerva's teaching philosophy and Umbridge's ideological requirements was immediate and irreconcilable, creating classroom tensions that affected not just their direct interactions but the entire atmosphere of the school as students and faculty alike were forced to navigate between competing visions of what education should accomplish. The medieval methods comment that would become legendary among those who witnessed it was spontaneous expression of disgust at approaches to student discipline that belonged to darker periods of magical history rather than modern educational practice. But it was Umbridge's appointment as High Inquisitor that transformed mere philosophical disagreement into active warfare between competing concepts of authority and accountability, as her new position gave her power to observe and evaluate teaching methods that she was fundamentally incapable of understanding or fairly assessing. The classroom visits that followed were exercises in professional humiliation, designed to intimidate faculty members into compliance with educational policies that served political rather than academic purposes. The observation of Minerva's transfiguration class became legendary among students who witnessed her response to Umbridge's continued interruptions and condescending questions about methods that had proven successful over decades of dedicated teaching. The statement that she did not generally permit people to talk while she was talking was delivered with the kind of controlled fury that made clear exactly what she thought of bureaucratic interference with educational processes that required concentration and respect to function effectively. The discovery of Dumbledore's army and the subsequent events that led to the headmaster's dramatic departure created power vacuum that Umbridge was eager to fill. Though her appointment as headmistress represented triumph of political manipulation over legitimate educational leadership, Minerva's fury at being passed over for the position was based not on personal ambition, but on recognition that the school was being placed under control of someone whose agenda would destroy everything that made Hogwarts worthy of the trust that parents placed in its educational mission. Her declaration that Dumbledore would not be leaving without a fight reflected not just personal loyalty, but professional conviction that some battles were too important to avoid, regardless of the personal consequences that resistance might entail. The sight of her drawing her wand in preparation for combat against Ministry forces demonstrated the depth of her commitment, while revealing the courage that had always characterized her approach to situations where principle conflicted with expedience or personal safety. But Dumbledore's order that she stand down was based on strategic considerations that transcended immediate confrontation, understanding that his departure would be temporary, while her destruction might be permanent if she allowed righteous anger to override tactical wisdom. The restraint she showed in following his instructions despite every instinct demanding action reflected the kind of discipline that effective resistance required, choosing long-term effectiveness over short-term satisfaction in ways that would prove crucial during the difficult months ahead. Umbridge's reign as headmistress transformed Hogwarts into something approaching totalitarian state where intellectual curiosity was discouraged and conformity was enforced through methods that ranged from petty harassment to physical punishment that violated every principle of civilized educational practice. The blood quill that she used to discipline students who dared to express opinions contrary to official ministry positions was a torture device that had no place in any institution claiming to serve children's welfare and patient development. The attack on Hagrid that resulted in Minerva's hospitalization was the culmination of tensions that had been building throughout the year, as Umbridge's authority was challenged by someone whose loyalty to Hogwarts transcended fear of bureaucratic retaliation or career consequences. The decision to assist Hagrid, despite the obvious danger, reflected both personal affection and professional conviction that colleagues deserved support when facing persecution for maintaining principles that education required. But the 4 stunning spells that struck her simultaneously were calculated assault designed not just to incapacitate, but to inflict maximum physical damage on someone whose opposition to Umbridge's regime had become too effective to tolerate. The fact that the attack came from behind while she was attempting to protect someone else demonstrated the cowardice that characterized those who served Umbridge's agenda, preferring overwhelming force and surprise tactics to fair confrontation with worthy opponent. The injuries that required her extended treatment at Street Mungo's were severe enough to threaten her life, and certainly compromised her magical abilities in ways that would persist long after her physical recovery was complete. The damage to her magical core from the concentrated curse impact created weaknesses that would make her vulnerable during future conflicts, while the psychological trauma of the assault affected her confidence in ways that she struggled to acknowledge even to herself. Professor Sprout's comment that she would have resigned in protest had students not been present reflected the outrage that Minerva's treatment provoked throughout the faculty, demonstrating that Umbridge's methods had finally exceeded what even the most diplomatic colleagues could tolerate or ignore. The cowardly nature of the attack, combined with its excessive brutality, had revealed the true character of those who served the ministry's increasingly authoritarian agenda. Her slow recovery during the summer months was marked by a gradual return of physical strength and magical capability, but also by growing awareness that the injuries she had sustained would affect her effectiveness for the remainder of her career. The walking difficulty that persisted despite magical healing served as constant reminder of the price that opposition to tyranny could exact, while the occasional weakness in her spellcasting created vulnerabilities that she had never previously experienced. But perhaps more significantly, the attack had strengthened her resolve rather than intimidated her into compliance, demonstrating that those who sought to control Hogwarts through fear and violence had fundamentally misunderstood the character of people they were attempting to intimidate. The woman who returned to the castle for the new school year carried with her not just physical scars, but enhanced determination to resist any future attempts to subordinate educational mission to political expediency. The departure of Umbridge following her unfortunate encounter with centaurs in the Forbidden Forest provided temporary relief from the most oppressive aspects of her reign, but the damage to institutional morale and educational standards would require years to fully repair. The The trust between faculty and administration that she had systematically destroyed needed rebuilding through patient demonstration that educational values would once again take precedence over bureaucratic convenience. Dumbledore's return to his position as headmaster was greeted with celebration throughout the school community, but his absence had demonstrated the vulnerability of institutions that depended too heavily on individual leadership rather than systematic protections against political interference. The reforms that would be needed to prevent similar future crises would require fundamental changes to how magical education was organized and protected from outside manipulation. The death of Sirius Black during the battle at the Ministry of Magic marked another devastating loss for Harry, while demonstrating the escalating violence that characterized Voldemort's return to power, creating casualties among those who had survived the previous war, only to fall victim to renewed conflict that seemed even more brutal and desperate than its predecessor. The psychological impact on Harry was profound and lasting, adding guilt and grief to burdens that were already almost too heavy for someone his age to bear. Minerva's response to these developments was characteristically practical, focusing on ways to strengthen Hogwarts' defenses while providing support for students who were struggling with the reality that the war had moved beyond abstract threat to immediate danger, affecting people they knew and cared about. The balance between maintaining normal educational activities and preparing for increasingly abnormal circumstances required constant adjustment as conditions continued to deteriorate. But it was Dumbledore's assassination at the end of the school year that delivered the most devastating blow to everyone who had depended on his wisdom and leadership, removing the one person whose strategic vision and accumulated knowledge made him uniquely capable of coordinating effective resistance against Voldemort's growing power. The manner of his death, betrayed by someone he had trusted and worked to redeem, added elements of tragedy and irony that made the loss even more difficult to process and accept. The Battle of the Astronomy Tower that preceded his death had provided Minerva with opportunity to demonstrate both her combat effectiveness and her absolute loyalty to colleagues who faced mortal danger, as she dueled Death Eaters with skill that exceeded what most would have expected from someone whose reputation was based primarily on educational rather than military achievements. Her defeat of Electo Caro was accomplished with efficiency that sent the Death Eater fleeing rather than continuing combat against opponent whose capabilities she had severely underestimated. But the sight of Dumbledore's body at the base of the tower was image that would haunt her for the remainder of her life, representing not just personal loss but symbolic defeat of everything he had represented about the possibility of wisdom and compassion, triumphing over hatred and violence. The funeral that followed was both celebration of his achievements and acknowledgement that his death had left void that could not be filled by any individual successor. Her appointment as headmistress in the aftermath of his death was recognition of her qualifications and the respect she commanded throughout the magical educational community, but it was also burden that she accepted with full understanding of the impossibility of replacing someone whose influence had extended far beyond administrative duties to encompass strategic leadership of resistance against dark forces. The position came with responsibilities that exceeded what any normal peacetime headmaster would face, requiring her to balance educational mission with military necessity in ways that had no precedent in Hogwarts history. But the political reality that followed Voldemort's infiltration of the Ministry meant that official recognition of her appointment was brief, as forces loyal to the Dark Lord moved quickly to place their own candidate in position to control the school and its potential influence on magical society. The replacement of her leadership with Severus Snape represented not just personal defeat, but institutional capture that would transform Hogwarts from sanctuary of learning into instrument of indoctrination and oppression. Snape's appointment as headmaster supported by the Caro siblings who would serve as his enforcers and ideological commissars, created situation that required Minerva to choose between abandoning the school to protect herself or remaining to provide what protection she could for students who would be subjected to systematic abuse and propaganda designed to break their spirits and convert them to Death Eater ideology. The choice, when presented in such terms, was never really in doubt despite the enormous personal risk that remaining would entail. Her decision to stay at Hogwarts and work within the system to protect students while subtly undermining the new administration's most harmful policies required tactical skills that her previous experience had not fully prepared her to employ. The balance between sufficient compliance to maintain her position and effective resistance to policies that threatened student welfare demanded constant vigilance and careful calculation of risks and benefits that could mean the difference between successful protection and catastrophic exposure. The Caro siblings' approach to discipline and curriculum was designed to break student morale while promoting acceptance of pure-blood supremacist ideology that justified any cruelty or injustice inflicted on those deemed inferior by accident of birth or blood status. Their use of physical punishment and psychological intimidation represented return to the darkest periods of magical education, when students were taught through fear rather than inspiration, and knowledge was viewed as commodity to be controlled rather than gift to be shared. But it was her covert support for the reformed Dumbledore's army that represented her most dangerous and important contribution to student resistance during this dark period, providing guidance and resources that allowed young people to maintain hope and organization, despite systematic attempts to crush their spirits and eliminate their capacity for independent thought. The secret meetings that she helped facilitate were exercises in both magical education and political resistance, teaching students skills they would need to survive, while nurturing the courage that would be required for eventual liberation. The psychological toll of maintaining such elaborate deception while witnessing daily abuse of students under her protection was enormous, creating internal conflicts between her natural inclination to confront injustice directly and the strategic necessity of preserving her position so that she could provide ongoing assistance to those who needed it most. The compromise between principle and pragmatism required constant self-discipline that tested every aspect of her character while demanding sacrifices that few would have been willing to make. Yet it was precisely during this period of greatest institutional darkness that her true greatness as educator and leader became most apparent, as she demonstrated that dedication to student welfare could survive and even flourish under conditions that might have broken someone with less profound commitment to educational mission. The protection she provided was often subtle and invisible, but it made the difference between survival and destruction for countless young people who depended on her courage and wisdom. The knowledge that liberation would eventually come, combined with absolute certainty that such liberation would require enormous sacrifice from everyone involved, created mixture of hope and dread that characterized her emotional state throughout the months of Death Eater control. The price of freedom would be measured in lives lost and innocence destroyed, but the alternative was acceptance of tyranny that would poison magical society for generations to come. The foundation was being laid for the final confrontation that would determine not just the immediate fate of Hogwarts, but the long-term character of magical civilization itself. And Minerva understood that her role in that battle would require everything she had learned about courage, sacrifice, and the protection of those who could not protect themselves. The woman who had spent decades preparing students for adult responsibilities would soon face the ultimate test of whether her own preparation had been adequate for the challenges that awaited her. The return of Harry Potter to Hogwarts during the final dark months of Death Eater control carried with it the promise of liberation and the certainty of devastation, as his presence at the castle could only mean that the moment for decisive confrontation had finally arrived. The young man who slipped through corridors that had been transformed from places of learning into instruments of oppression bore the weight of prophecy and purpose that would determine the fate of everyone who called the magical world home, while his obvious desperation suggested that time for careful planning and gradual preparation had run out completely. The encounter in Ravenclaw Tower began as routine enforcement of curfew regulations, but escalated into the pivotal moment when years of careful concealment and strategic patience would give way to open warfare between forces of light and darkness that could no longer coexist within the same space. Minerva's discovery of the unconscious Alecto Caro sprawled beneath the bronze eagle knocker was immediate indication that the delicate balance she had maintained between compliance and resistance was about to collapse entirely, forcing choices that would commit everyone present to paths from which there could be no retreat. Amicus Caro's arrival at the tower created the confrontation that had been building throughout the months of Death Eater occupation, as his fury over his sister's condition and his immediate assumption that students were responsible revealed both the paranoia and the incompetence that characterized those who served Voldemort's regime. His demand that Minerva summon the Dark Lord to deal with what he perceived as student rebellion demonstrated the kind of reflexive resort to superior authority that marked those who possessed power without understanding or wisdom to wield it effectively. But it was her flat refusal to comply with his demand that marked the moment when pretense ended and genuine battle lines were drawn. Her quiet, "I shall not," carrying more weight and authority than all his bluster and threats combined. The simple statement was declaration of war against tyranny that had infected the institution she loved. Acknowledgement that some compromises were too fundamental to accept, regardless of the consequences that resistance might bring to herself and those she sought to protect. The spitting incident that followed represented the complete breakdown of any pretense of civilized discourse, Caro's assault being both literally disgusting and symbolically significant as demonstration of the contempt that Death Eaters held for anyone who dared oppose their will. The violation was personal and deliberate, designed to humiliate someone whose dignity and authority had become obstacles to the complete subjugation that the regime demanded from all who served under its dominion. Harry's revelation of himself and his immediate retaliation against Caro was intervention that transformed mere confrontation between faculty and Death Eater into something approaching rescue operation, though the magic he employed was advanced beyond what most seventh-year students could have achieved and delivered with precision that spoke of experience with genuine combat rather than classroom instruction. The Cruciatus curse that sent Caro flying across the room was justice served with efficiency that made clear how much the war had changed everyone involved in fighting it. Her instruction that Harry should flee immediately was based on understanding that his presence at Hogwarts would trigger responses from Voldemort that would endanger every student and faculty member who remained within the castle's walls. But his revelation that he was operating under Dumbledore's final orders changed everything by making clear that this confrontation was not accidental encounter, but culmination of plans that had been set in motion by the greatest strategic mind that magical Britain had ever produced. The moment when she drew herself up to her full height and declared that they would secure the school against he who must not be named, while Harry searched for his mysterious object, was transformation from educator to military commander, accepting responsibility for defending institution and students against forces whose power exceeded anything that normal school security had been designed to counter. The promise carried with it acknowledgement that such defense would require methods and accept casualties that peacetime thinking would never have contemplated. But it was the simple exchange of greeting between former teacher and student. "It's good to see you," answered with, "It's good to see you too, Professor," that provided moment of human connection amid circumstances that had reduced most interactions to tactical necessity and strategic calculation. The brief recognition of personal relationship that transcended immediate crisis offered glimpse of the values and connections that made their struggle worthwhile, even as it demanded everything they possessed to achieve victory. The coordinated action that she organized with Professors Sprout and Flitwick to drive Snape from the castle was a masterpiece of tactical planning and execution that demonstrated the combat capabilities that decades of peaceful academic life had concealed but never eliminated from those who had lived through the previous war. Their combined magical assault was delivered with precision and overwhelming force that made clear exactly what they thought of his collaboration with forces that had perverted everything Hogwarts represented. Snape's retreat was accomplished with desperate haste that spoke to his recognition that remaining would mean facing justice that his crimes had earned, while his method of departure, shattering windows to transform into smoke and flee through the night, revealed both his magical capabilities and his fundamental cowardice when confronted by opponents who possessed comparable skills and superior moral authority. The departure ended the pretense that Death Eater control of Hogwarts was legitimate or sustainable when faced by determined resistance from those who understood the school's true mission. The evacuation of underage students was conducted with efficiency that reflected years of preparation for emergency situations, though the scope and urgency of current crisis exceeded what normal disaster planning had anticipated. The youngest children were removed from immediate danger through portkey transportation that had been arranged through order connections, while older students, who might be capable of contributing to the defense, were given choice between evacuation and participation that honored their approaching adulthood, while acknowledging the life or death nature of the decisions they were making. But it was her announcement that students of age would be permitted to remain and fight if they chose that marked the complete transformation of Hogwarts from educational institution into fortress preparing for siege warfare, acknowledging that some battles were too important to leave entirely to adults, while recognizing that young people who had received magical education had both capabilities and rights that deserved respect, even in circumstances where their participation might prove fatal. The defense preparations that followed drew upon knowledge and resources that had been carefully accumulated during the months of Death Eater occupation, as secret plans that had been developed by faculty members were finally implemented with coordination that demonstrated just how extensively they had prepared for the moment when pretense would no longer be sufficient protection. The magical barriers that were erected around the school's perimeter were sophisticated beyond what most attackers would expect, while the internal defenses were designed to provide fallback positions that could channel invaders into carefully prepared killing grounds. Her coordination of these defensive measures required tactical thinking that drew upon every aspect of her magical education and professional experience, combining theoretical knowledge of protective enchantments with practical understanding of how determined enemies would attempt to overcome such barriers. The spells she employed were enhanced versions of conventional protective magic, modified through decades of study, and improved through collaboration with colleagues whose own specialties provided crucial components for comprehensive defense. But perhaps most significantly, the defense of Hogwarts represented the culmination of her entire career as educator, as she found herself literally fighting to protect the institution and students that had given meaning to every choice she had made. Since returning to the castle as young professor decades earlier, the battle was both military engagement and symbolic struggle between competing visions of what magical society should become, with victory or defeat determining whether future generations would inherit a world based on knowledge and compassion or fear and hatred. The combat skills that she displayed during the battle exceeded what most who knew her primarily as teacher would have believed possible, demonstrating that her years of intelligence work during the First War and her recent experience of Death Eater persecution had prepared her for exactly this kind of confrontation. Her dueling technique was economical and devastating, wasting no motion or energy, while delivering spells with precision that made every casting count toward tactical objectives that extended beyond mere survival to encompass protection of others who were less capable of defending themselves. The leadership she provided throughout the battle was inspirational in ways that went beyond simple tactical competence, as her presence on the front lines of the fighting encouraged others to maintain resistance even when the odds seemed overwhelming and casualties mounted to levels that might have broken less determined defenders. The sight of their deputy headmistress fighting with skill and courage that matched anything the war's most famous heroes had achieved provided psychological advantage that was as valuable as any magical weapon or defensive spell. But it was her participation in the final confrontation with Voldemort himself that represented the ultimate test of everything she had learned about courage, sacrifice, and the protection of those who could not protect themselves. The duel that she fought alongside Horace Slughorn and Kingsley Shacklebolt against the most powerful dark wizard in magical history was engagement between forces whose victory or defeat would determine the character of magical civilization for generations to come. The magical energies unleashed during this confrontation were so intense that reality itself seemed to bend and warp under the pressure, creating effects that challenged every assumption about what individual wizards could achieve through force of will and accumulated knowledge. Voldemort's power was overwhelming in its scope and ruthless in its application, seeking not just to defeat his opponents but to destroy them so completely that their resistance would serve as warning to anyone else who might consider opposing his authority. Yet the coordination between the three experienced fighters created tactical advantages that even Voldemort's superior individual power could not easily overcome, as their combined assault forced him to divide his attention while preventing him from focusing the full scope of his abilities on any single opponent. Their defensive cooperation provided mutual protection that allowed all three to survive magical attacks that would have been instantly fatal to any wizard fighting alone against such overwhelming opposition. But perhaps most importantly, their joint resistance demonstrated that Voldemort's power, however great, was not absolute or unchallengeable when faced by opponents who possessed not just magical skill, but moral authority that gave their cause strength beyond what personal ambition or selfish desire could ever provide. The battle was testament to the possibility that evil could be resisted successfully by those who understood what they were fighting for and were willing to risk everything to protect it. Harry's intervention in the duel and his final confrontation with Voldemort was a moment that justified every sacrifice that had been made throughout the long years of resistance. As the young wizard whose protection had motivated so much of the strategic planning and tactical preparation finally fulfilled the destiny that his survival as infant had created. The magic that destroyed the Dark Lord was triumph, not just of individual heroism, but of collaborative effort that had sustained resistance through the darkest periods and prepared conditions for ultimate victory. The silence that followed Voldemort's destruction was profound and disorienting after months of constant vigilance and preparation for conflict, creating space for emotional reactions that had been suppressed during the immediate crisis, but now demanded acknowledgement and processing. The relief was overwhelming but complicated by grief for those who had been lost during the battle and recognition that victory had been purchased through sacrifices that could never be adequately repaid or forgotten. The casualties that littered the Great Hall were testament to the price that freedom had demanded from those brave enough to fight for it, while the injuries suffered by survivors created obligations for care and support that would extend far beyond the immediate aftermath of battle. The victory celebration that would eventually come was tempered by understanding that some losses were too profound to be balanced by any achievement, no matter how significant or necessary. But amid the devastation and grief was recognition that something extraordinary had been accomplished through the combined efforts of people who had refused to accept tyranny as inevitable or evil as unstoppable force. The institution that had been preserved through their sacrifice would continue to serve future generations of magical students, while the society they had protected retained the possibility of growth and improvement that would have been lost forever under Voldemort's rule. Minerva's survival of the battle was both personal triumph and institutional necessity, as her knowledge and experience would be crucial for the rebuilding process that would be required to restore Hogwarts to its former excellence, while learning from the failures that had made Death Eater infiltration possible. The woman who emerged from the conflict carried with her not just satisfaction at victory achieved, but understanding of the vigilance that would be required to prevent similar threats from developing in the future. The recognition that came through various honors and awards was meaningful acknowledgement of service that had extended far beyond normal professional obligations to encompass the kind of sacrifice and dedication that defined true heroism. But more significant than external recognition was the knowledge that she had proved worthy of the trust that generations of students and colleagues had placed in her leadership, demonstrating that some principles were worth defending regardless of personal cost. The task of rebuilding would require everything she had learned about education, administration, and human nature during her decades of service, but it would be undertaken with confidence that came from having faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious. The foundation had been preserved for whatever new challenges the future might bring, secured through blood and sacrifice that gave it strength no enemy could easily overcome. The woman who had begun her career as strict but caring teacher had evolved through decades of service into something approaching legendary figure, someone whose name would be spoken with reverence by future generations, who benefited from the peace that her generation had purchased through their willingness to fight for principles that transcended individual survival or comfort. The legacy was secure, built on achievements that would endure long after those who had created them had passed from living memory into the honored history of those who had served something greater than themselves. The recognition that came in the immediate aftermath of Voldemort's defeat was overwhelming in its scope and intensity, as a wizarding world that had lived under the shadow of terror for nearly 2 decades struggled to express gratitude that matched the magnitude of what had been accomplished by those who had refused to surrender hope, even during the darkest periods of the conflict. The Order of Merlin, First Class, that was bestowed upon Minerva, represented acknowledgement of service that had extended far beyond normal expectations of duty, encompassing decades of sacrifice and dedication that had contributed crucially to the ultimate victory over forces of darkness. But perhaps more meaningful than official recognition was the simple fact of survival itself, the opportunity to witness the restoration of peace and to participate in the rebuilding process that would determine what kind of magical society would emerge from the wreckage of war. The woman who had spent years watching evil corrupt and destroy everything she valued now had the chance to help create something better, drawing upon hard-won wisdom about human nature and institutional vulnerability to establish protections that might prevent similar catastrophes from developing in future generations. The chocolate frog card that immortalized her image and achievements was honor that she admitted having never imagined receiving, representing a form of popular recognition that placed her alongside the most celebrated figures in magical history, while acknowledging that her contributions had earned her permanent place in the pantheon of those whose service had shaped the character of wizarding civilization. The card would ensure that her story reached children who had never known the terror that her generation had faced, providing them with example of dedication and courage that might inspire their own choices when faced with challenges that tested their character. Yet, even as external honors accumulated and public acclaim reached levels that sometimes felt overwhelming, Minerva's primary focus remained on the practical tasks of restoration and renewal that would determine whether the victory achieved through such enormous sacrifice would result in lasting improvement or merely temporary respite, before new forms of darkness emerged to threaten everything that had been preserved. The return to her position as headmistress was not celebration of personal achievement, but acceptance of responsibility that would require every skill and insight she had developed during her decades of service to education and resistance. The Hogwarts that reopened in September of 1998 was both the same ancient institution that had educated generations of witches and wizards and something entirely new, transformed by recent experiences in ways that would influence its character and mission for centuries to come. The physical damage inflicted during the battle had been repaired through magical reconstruction that restored walls and windows to their original condition, but the psychological and spiritual wounds would require different forms of healing that could only be accomplished through patient attention to the needs of those who had survived trauma that would mark them permanently. The students who returned to the castle carried with them memories and experiences that distinguished them fundamentally from previous generations, having witnessed horrors that no children should have been forced to endure, while demonstrating courage and resilience that exceeded what most adults could have managed under similar circumstances. Their education would need to acknowledge what they had seen and done, while helping them develop the psychological tools necessary to build meaningful lives, despite the scars that their experiences had left on their hearts and minds. The curriculum modifications that she implemented during these early years of reconstruction were designed to address both practical needs created by the war and deeper questions about how magical education could better prepare students for challenges that traditional academic instruction had never anticipated. The enhanced defense against the dark arts program was obvious necessity, but equally important were new courses in healing, conflict resolution, and the ethical application of power that reflected understanding of how dangerous knowledge could become when wielded by those who lacked proper moral foundation. But perhaps her most significant innovation was the requirement that all students participate in community service projects that brought them into contact with those who had suffered during the war, creating opportunities for healing that benefited both helpers and recipients, while fostering a sense of shared responsibility for rebuilding the society that their generation would inherit. These programs connected abstract moral principles with concrete actions that demonstrated the practical application of values that academic instruction could describe, but not fully convey. The hiring of Neville Longbottom as professor of herbology was a decision that reflected both practical considerations about his exceptional abilities in the subject and symbolic recognition of how the war had transformed ordinary students into extraordinary individuals whose courage and growth deserved acknowledgement and opportunity. His appointment represented continuity with Hogwarts tradition, while acknowledging that leadership could emerge from unexpected sources when circumstances demanded heroism from those who might never have imagined themselves capable of such achievement. Neville's evolution from the frightened, accident-prone student who had struggled with confidence and magical control into the professor who commanded respect and admiration from colleagues and students alike was testament to the transformative power of belief and power, opportunity when provided by those who could see potential where Others might perceive only limitation. His success validated her educational philosophy about the importance of recognizing and nurturing hidden strengths while refusing to accept surface appearances as permanent indicators of individual capability or worth. The relationship that developed between Minerva and her former student was both professional collaboration and ongoing education for both, as his fresh perspectives and recent experiences enhanced her understanding of how traditional methods might be improved, while her accumulated wisdom and institutional knowledge provided guidance that helped him avoid pitfalls that inexperience might otherwise create. Their partnership demonstrated the kind of mutual respect and support that made Hogwarts faculty exceptional in ways that went beyond individual competence to encompass collective commitment to excellence. The memorial garden that was established in the castle grounds to honor those who had died during the war was designed to serve multiple purposes, providing space for grief and remembrance while creating living symbol of renewal and hope that would grow and evolve over time as testimony to the permanent value of their sacrifice. The magical plants that were chosen for the garden included species from around the world, representing the international scope of the conflict, while demonstrating that beauty and life could flourish even in places that had been touched by violence and death. The annual ceremony held in the garden became one of the most meaningful traditions that she established during her tenure as headmistress, bringing together survivors and family members in observance that honored the dead, while celebrating the continuation of values and institutions that their sacrifice had preserved. The speeches delivered during these gatherings emphasized not just loss but legacy, focusing on how the fallen had contributed to victory that made possible the peace and freedom that subsequent generations would inherit. But it was the quiet moments of individual reflection that the garden provided throughout the year that fulfilled its most important function, offering space where students and faculty could process emotions and memories that daily responsibilities required them to set aside but never fully forget. The magic that infused the space created atmosphere of peace and acceptance that facilitated healing, while serving as constant reminder that some sacrifices were too precious to be diminished by the passage of time or the demands of ordinary life. The challenges of maintaining institutional excellence while accommodating the psychological needs of those who had been traumatized by war required constant attention to balance between high standards that preserved Hogwarts' reputation and compassionate flexibility that acknowledged individual circumstances that might affect student performance. The disciplinary policies that she developed during this period were informed by understanding that some behavioral problems reflected underlying trauma rather than simple defiance or laziness, requiring therapeutic rather than punitive responses. Yet her commitment to academic excellence never wavered, as she understood that lowering standards would ultimately disserve students who needed to develop capabilities that would serve them throughout their adult lives, regardless of the difficulties they had faced during their youth. The challenge was distinguishing between reasonable accommodation that helped struggling students achieve their potential and enabling behaviors that prevented growth and development that education was meant to facilitate. The counseling services that were expanded during her administration reflected recognition that some forms of learning could only occur when students felt emotionally safe and psychologically supported, while the enhanced security measures that were implemented demonstrated that protection of physical safety remained essential foundation for all other aspects of educational mission. The balance between openness and vigilance required constant adjustment as threats evolved and circumstances changed, but the principle that education required both intellectual challenge and emotional security remained constant guide for policy development. The international relationships that she cultivated with other magical schools were designed to share knowledge about effective responses to trauma and conflict, while building connections that could help prevent future wars through improved communication and mutual understanding. The exchange programs that were established allowed students to experience different magical traditions while providing faculty with opportunities to learn techniques that had been developed in other educational systems. But perhaps her greatest achievement during the post-war period was the creation of educational environment that honored the past while embracing the future, acknowledging the lessons learned through suffering while refusing to be paralyzed by memories of trauma. The students who graduated under her leadership carried with them not just magical knowledge and practical skills, but understanding of their responsibility to use their capabilities in service of justice and protection for those who could not protect themselves. The teaching methods that she refined during these years incorporated insights gained through decades of experience with both educational theory and practical application, under extraordinary circumstances, creating approaches that could adapt to individual student needs while maintaining standards that prepared graduates for challenges that peaceful times might not reveal, but which history demonstrated would inevitably emerge. Her classroom became laboratory for pedagogical innovation that influenced magical education throughout Britain and beyond. The mentorship that she provided to younger faculty members was characterized by the same combination of high expectations and patient support that had defined her relationships with students, understanding that effective teachers required both technical competence and wisdom about human nature that could only be developed through experience, guided by those who had faced similar challenges. Her leadership style emphasized collaboration and mutual learning, while maintaining clear lines of authority and accountability that institutional function required. The philosophy of education that she articulated during lectures and conferences became influential throughout the magical academic community, emphasizing the importance of character development alongside intellectual achievement, while arguing that true education required students to confront difficult questions about power, responsibility, and the moral choices that would define their adult lives. Her speeches were studies in the integration of theory and practice, drawing upon personal experience to illuminate principles that might otherwise remain abstract. The autobiography that she was persuaded to write during her later years as headmistress became required reading in magical education programs throughout the world, providing insights into the challenges and rewards of dedicated service while offering practical guidance for those who sought to follow similar paths. The book was characterized by the same honesty and precision that had distinguished her teaching, acknowledging failures and limitations alongside achievements, while maintaining focus on lessons that others might apply in their own circumstances. But it was her approach to retirement planning that most clearly revealed her understanding of institutional responsibility and personal legacy, as she worked systematically to ensure that her departure would not create vacuum that might compromise Hogwarts' ability to maintain excellence and adapt to changing circumstances. The succession plans that she developed were comprehensive and flexible, providing multiple options for leadership transition, while establishing systems that could function effectively regardless of individual personalities or preferences. The foundations and endowments that she helped establish during her final years as headmistress were designed to support ongoing innovation and improvement in magical education, while providing resources that could address unexpected challenges or opportunities that future generations might encounter. Her financial management demonstrated the same careful attention to detail that had characterized all aspects of her professional service, ensuring that resources were allocated efficiently while maintaining reserves that could support institutional mission during difficult periods. The recognition ceremonies that marked her approaching retirement were occasions for reflection on achievements that extended far beyond what any individual could have accomplished alone, acknowledging the collaborative nature of institutional success while celebrating the particular contributions that her leadership had made possible. The testimonials, offered by former students and colleagues, provided testimony to influence that had shaped thousands of lives while contributing to preservation and advancement of knowledge that would benefit countless future generations. Yet, even as honors accumulated and retirement approached, her primary concern remained the welfare of students who would inherit the world that her generation had struggled to preserve and improve. Understanding that true measure of her success would be determined not by external recognition, but by whether those who followed would be equipped to face challenges that could not be anticipated, but which would certainly test their character and capabilities in ways that would determine the future of magical civilization. The legacy that she prepared to leave was both personal achievement and institutional contribution, reflecting decades of service that had transformed not just individual lives, but the entire character of magical education. The woman who had begun her career as strict but caring teacher had evolved into leader whose influence extended far beyond her specific area of expertise to encompass broader questions about how knowledge should be shared and how power should be exercised in service of justice and protection for those who needed such protection most desperately. The final lesson that her career provided was demonstration that extraordinary achievement was possible for those who were willing to subordinate personal desires to service of causes larger than themselves, while understanding that such service required not martyrdom, but sustainable dedication that could persist through decades of challenge and change. The balance between individual fulfillment and institutional mission had been maintained through careful attention to values and priorities that remained constant even when circumstances required adaptation and flexibility. The peace that her generation had won through enormous sacrifice would require vigilant protection by those who followed, but the foundation had been established for whatever new challenges the future might bring. The institutions that had been preserved and strengthened would serve as bulwarks against darkness while providing resources for growth and development that could address problems that had not yet been imagined. The young people who had been educated under her guidance would carry forward principles and capabilities that made continued progress possible while honoring the memory of those whose sacrifice had made their opportunities possible. The woman who prepared to step down from active leadership could do so with confidence that her life had been well spent in service of values that would outlive her individual existence, contributing to achievements that would benefit generations yet unborn, while demonstrating that dedication to excellence and justice could make difference that extended far beyond what any single lifetime might encompass. The torch was ready to be passed to new hands, but the flame would continue burning as testimony to the possibility of service that transcended personal limitation to achieve something approaching genuine greatness. Rest now, young witch or wizard, as our tale of Minerva McGonagall draws to its peaceful close. In the quiet darkness of this magical hour, let yourself be comforted by the memory of a woman who never wavered in her dedication to those who needed her protection, whose stern exterior concealed a heart that beat with fierce love for every student who passed through her care. Her scarred hands and weary eyes may have finally found rest, but the spirit of unwavering dedication lives on in every teacher who follows her example, every student who stands against injustice when others cannot or will not. As you drift toward dreams, remember that true greatness isn't found in grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but in the daily choice to demand excellence while providing support, to maintain standards while showing compassion, to protect the innocent even when that protection requires everything you have to give. McGonagall's greatest magic wasn't in her transfiguration spells or her animagus form, but in her unwavering belief that every child deserved the chance to become their best self, regardless of the obstacles they faced or the darkness that surrounded them. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the magical world, someone keeps watch in the tradition she established. And in your dreams, may you find the wisdom of Minerva McGonagall, the courage of those who choose duty over comfort, and the peace that comes from understanding that some battles, once fought with honor and sacrifice, keep us all safe forever.